Remember when Haas and Dylan were debating and they kept acting like they were gonna box each other? What a interesting thing to say. That is a very interesting thing to say because John is gonna be debating Dylan Burns tonight. So, you know, we might see some of that old energy back. We might see some of that good old, you know. We'll see. It's gonna be cool. And since I am an expert on NATO and on everything, you know, then I can give my expertise. Oh my god, it is starting. I think.
MAGA movement, the
What
Make
is
America Great Again
this?
movement. And,
Where's John?
I would say
I'm here
nationalist
for
viewpoint
John.
of conservative politics.
Where's
And so
Yes.
I wanted to.
This
One or the
doesn't
other.
work.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Well, now we can hear you. Yes.
Can you see me too or no?
No.
We just see your profile.
We
picture.
cannot see you, John.
Oh, okay. All right.
Bottom right hand
Nobody
corner,
cares
click
about Larry.
the button
All I
that
care
says
about is John.
video.
There's nobody here but
I figured that
John.
one out.
John
See
is
that?
the only
Anyways,
thing I
it's out.
notice in this.
Man, I guess you're crushing me. I don't even see that button. I just see join voice in the waiting room live. But I do see.
Nice.
Yeah.
If you hover your thing. Oh wait, I don't think he separated it. 1 second.
Oh wait, here we go.
You got it?
We're good. Yeah.
Is
Fantastic.
John also a boomer?
Alright, we got everybody.
Oh
Okay.
no. Okay. Oh gosh.
The first
I-
obstacle has been overcome. Okay, are we all ready
Yes.
to go? We're all settled in. We got our wiggles out, everything like that.
All right.
Let's do it.
I
Great.
am excited.
Then hello. Welcome
John
one and all
is
to yet another
upper
episode
right
of
corner.
Dippy Dippy Podcast. I, Wick TV,
Isn't
will
it
be your guest
round
host for
table
tonight
anymore?
as Dylan Burns, Counterpoints, Larry Sharp, and John Jackman discuss
Wow.
tonight's topic.
All right.
NATO. Should NATO lead America and Europe into the 21st century? A couple rules for the road for tonight. No slurs, no misgendering.
John is
all
not a
friendly.
communist.
When
I
I'm
know
speaking,
too much
please
about
be
John.
silent.
Trust me. He's
And
not a communist.
the opening and closing statement should be no more than 2 minutes.
No more than 5
if
seconds.
during the open discussion you're having trouble getting in or feel as if you're being spoken over, please raise your hand or otherwise get my attention and I'll make space.
Get
for
my
you. If the
attention.
conversation is stuck, or if I don't understand what is being talked about, it's likely the audience doesn't understand what's being talked about. So I'll ask questions to keep both sides,
Sure.
to keep it flowing
Wait,
and
did I
to make sure
master-
that there's clarity.
Master
With that,
Knight.
let's discuss. We're going to start with counterpoints, and we'll just go in alternating order. Counterpoints, your opening statement on should NATO lead America and Europe into the 21st century? Give us your thoughts, sir.
Please.
Yeah, this is going to be an obvious yes for me. I think that power abhors a vacuum. I think that if you look at the conflicts that have happened since World War II, they've largely been prevented through hegemonic power. I think that Europe and the United States of America are, natural allies due to historical ties. I think that keeping the Eastern European theater cold as best you can, considering current events,
Too
is
late
going to be
for
the best
that.
way forward. I think that withdrawing from the stage invites former rivals to assert their power regionally and eventually globally.
Right.
And I also think that those regional powers, if you look at the governmental, political, and moral systems that they operate under, I subscribe to Joe Biden's perspective of you don't compare yourself to the almighty, you compare yourself to the alternative. I think the Western
Satan.
global hegemonic American-led order is preferred to the alternative. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Larry Sharp. Please give us your thoughts on this.
NATO is a facade for American empire, and that's the problem. It is an empire. It's we've been at war since 1950. For someone to say it's kept the peace is a joke.
1949,
We've
by
been
the way,
at
not
war since
1950.
1950 constantly, but thanks to things like NATO,
1949.
we haven't declared war since 1942. So America has been at war for the last 70 some odd 80 years, and yet we haven't declared war since 1942. Why? Because we have to become the empire. We have to become the police of the world. What does this empire do? The empire does several things. The empire creates the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex allows us to start having a jobs program in America so that other people can die and be hurt and be maimed and all those things. It is the wrong answer. It allows that now 60% of our manufacturing in America somehow is related to the military-industrial complex. I see it here in New York State all the time. Not just that, it destroys localism. It destroys local democracies. It destroys local freedom.
Oh,
Destroys
you mean like
everything local, and
Ukraine?
by default, then destroys our freedom. We are an empire. Basically, the advantage is that
What
when
an
the British
empty
Empire fell, they
opening
had a
statement.
son, us. We took over the business. Most of the times when empires fail, things get terrible. They didn't get that bad for us. Why? After World War II, we basically had a monopoly on the world. We took advantage of that monopoly. We took advantage of our dollar. And we decided
What
to
are you rooting for in this debate? Okay. I'm gonna poll the chat. Okay? There you go. Whew!
totally control the entire
No, they
world.
mean the
So
US.
now what's the end of that? What
course.
happens now? The world begins to be angry
They
at us.
think the United
Europeans become
States,
angry at
because
us.
NATO
We're
is
now
basically
responsible
about
for
the
almost
United
every
States
single war there
commitment to
is.
Europe.
And now the defense is BRICS. So what
Like,
happened
it
is
started
after
in
World War II ended,
1958
we had to have NATO. I
with
get
the
it. I'm not mad at,
Brussels
at that point.
Treaty,
But at one point,
and
it had
then
to
it
go away.
expanded into the
Once the Soviet Union fell,
North
it should have gone
Atlantic
away. And
Treaty.
it didn't. So now what have we done?
Because
We've just
Europe
made
was not
sure we
ready
kept
to
the
sort of
Cold
tackle
War.
the Soviet Union
NATO
alone.
keeps the Cold War. NATO keeps us angry. NATO keeps our empire. It's a facade and should go away.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Dylan Burns.
There we go.
What's your thoughts here?
All right.
Sure. I don't think that NATO's purpose was to stop all war or war on every continent. NATO's main purpose was to stop war in Europe, was to stop a Soviet incursion into Europe, a Soviet invasion in Europe, and now his identity has transformed into mainly counteracting the Russians and them pushing into Europe. And now many of the states that used to be part of the Soviet Union have joined NATO, trying to fight against that. The purpose of NATO was never to stop wars in, say, Africa, or wars in, say, South
And,
America, wars in
Soviet
Asia.
sphere,
What I think would be best with NATO is when NATO is as simple as possible. NATO started with 14 original articles, and most of those articles were either reaffirmations of the UN Charter or just clarifications on Article 5. And the really important part of NATO is Article 5, is collective defense agreement. People could take or leave the 40 partner nations of NATO. People could take or leave any of the counter-terrorism, the 40 partner nations of NATO. People could take...
There's also another few important parts to NATO that are taken for granted but still are very important. Namely that members of NATO cannot attack each other, right? And that they cannot sort of invade other places.
Take or leave any of the counterterrorism operations or anti-piracy operations or any of the additional tasks that NATO has been given. But when it comes to the primary task, the penultimate task, the main task of NATO, which is stopping a Soviet invasion of Europe and now stopping a Russian invasion of NATO, which is now the main identity of NATO, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO has been more than successful. It has been the gold standard in stopping that. There are countries that have been clearly defined as nations that the Russian government would want to invade or thinks that
Poland.
either they belong to them through some historical empire, some historical civilization that they claim allegiance to. I don't believe that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, by destroying NATO, that would stop war. I think it could cause invasion. I don't think that by having all these Eastern Europeans abandon the alliance structure that has allowed them to have some sense of security after the chaos of the 90s, after the Soviet collapse and the Yugoslav civil wars, is smart. I don't think NATO is a good option. I think NATO is the only option to prevent the spiraling out of war in Europe.
True.
That's that's my practical argument. I have a moral argument, but I'll stay there.
Remember that NATO's job is to keep the US in, keep the USSR out, or Russia in today's world, and keep Germany down. Take that, AFD.
Sure. We'll get into it,
Like
I'm
that.
sure, during the open. But last, but certainly not least, John.
John!
What are your thoughts?
John!
Thanks for having me on. I think it's very clear that NATO is an
John.
aggressive and offensive alliance for the purpose of maintaining the U.S. empire. Now, NATO has taken multiple aggressive actions since the fall of the Soviet Union, including the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, its actions in Afghanistan, and its actions in Libya, all of which left these regions far worse off than they were before. Now, it's very clear that NATO, it's not even a question of whether or not NATO should lead the world into the 21st century. The real question is whether NATO does lead the world into the 21st century. If it does, what can be assured are that the organic bonds of sociality, which connect entire regions, and entire
Organic bonds!
civilizations, will be destroyed as they have been at multiple junctures. Now, once again, you don't even have to take my word for it, but you can take NATO leaders themselves who have said in the 2010s that NATO exists primarily to ensure security of the global energy system. Now, what does this mean? This means that NATO is a world empire. This means that NATO is made for the purpose of promoting U.S. hegemony in the interest not only of U.S. hegemony, but of the U.S. financial elites, the elites that are based in the United States and the collective West. And they will stop at nothing to expand this power. The notion that the defensive alliance rings extremely hollow when even the accession of multiple NATO member states was acquired through, as I mentioned, the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, among a number of other coercive measures. So for me, it's very clear. We can talk more details, but even at the very beginning of NATO, I think that you could argue that NATO was basically a holdover, a remnant, a way for the European colonial nations of centuries past to continue to promote a hegemony in global domination. And the scary thing about NATO is that it has taken us not only from a world in which nations, specific nations, can act like empires, but depersonalized institutions that don't even have the loyalty to a specific nation.
Poland can be an empire in NATO.
Declare war and destroy entire countries and regions for the benefit, again, of the major financial interests that have something to gain. So this is the purpose of NATO, and I think that it's not a question of whether NATO should lead the world into the 21st century, but that if NATO tries, it will destroy the world and take us all with it.
Okay.
Oh my God!
Strong words. Thank you for being here. And with that, I guess the first question I have for you all to kind of, start discussion off here.
John.
Both Larry Sharp and John Jackman alluded to the fact that they feel that NATO, when we talk about NATO
will
simply
destroy the
talking
world.
about American empire. Do we all agree with that statement? And has American empire been a force for good or evil overall in the world? What do we think?
Jesus,
Yeah,
that is
don't
such
worry,
a
don't worry,
childish
Rick. I got
way of
plenty to
viewing
chop
the
down
world.
on.
Whether something is a force for
listen,
good or evil.
I have no problems with
cartoonish view
their
of the
assessment.
world.
I feel like this is like an IQ evaluation, you know, the bell curve where it's like 80
True.
IQ, 100
Very
IQ,
correct,
140
Bell
IQ. And it's like, you know, American empire exists. And then no, it doesn't. And then yes, it does. No, I agree that it exists. American, Western, hegemonic, commercial empire, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
I agree that it exists. It's a question of whether or not it's good. And so, Larry, you brought up an interesting historical fact that I think is
states are not
indisputable, which
good
is
or
we haven't
bad.
declared war since
States just
1942.
are.
Well, the reason why we haven't declared war
come
since
on.
1942 is because we're not fighting nation states.
States
Oftentimes
aren't
we're fighting
moral
like
agents.
paramilitary organizations or insurgencies.
Repeat after
or,
me.
you know,
States
like
aren't
the
moral
Viet Minh or the
agents
Viet
to
Cong,
be
or
good
we're
or
fighting
bad.
the Taliban or whatever. And what I would say to you is while wars are incredibly destructive, kill hundreds of thousands of people, et cetera, most of the conflicts in the middle and late 20th century would be a bad month in World War I or World War II. On comparison, on the level of blood.
You're Marine like I am. We declared war on the Barbary pirates in the 1800s, and they were not a country. We have declared war against things that aren't nations. War does not have to be declared upon a nation. War can be declared upon a group of people, whatever it is. There's no rule on what you declare war on. We've done it before.
Okay, and you think that the War on Terror, where we came out with the articles that like basically declared like jihadist organizations or anyone allied with Al Qaeda was an insufficient political declaration?
Of course, it was not a declaration of war. That's why we're still fighting it. People are dying right now. There are people. We just lost people in North Africa now. We lost them just recently. Why? Because we're still fighting this war on terror. Exactly. This is a terrible idea.
Why do you put
part of
war on
American
terror in
empire.
quotations? Why do you put war on terror in quotations?
Because terror is not a group. Terror is an idea. Now, if they declared war on Al Qaeda, I'm okay with declaring war on Al Qaeda or declaring war on ISIS. That makes sense to me. Declaring war on terror, like the war on drugs. Whenever we declare a war on something like that, that thing wins. Terror won. The drugs won. That's not how it works. Poverty won.
Wait, if
every time we
it's-
declare war on
If it's
something,
not a war,
that
then
thing
how can
wins.
it win?
No. See, this is again where I feel like we just have a fundamental disagreement on it. Just because you declare that
We
you
do.
are entering, we are entering armed conflict against an idea. So, for instance, poverty. Of course, that's never going to end. But if you look at the past 50 years or 100 years, you can see the quality of life of human beings raising across the entire globe. When you declare a war on terror, and we're still
necessarily
engaged with that
across
20
the
or 30
entire
years
globe.
later, that's because there's still terrorist organizations that
Hey,
are
let John
around the globe
speak.
that engage in
Guy,
jihadist
you're
terrorism and
taking
other
too
forms
much
of terrorism
time.
where they think
Guy,
that an acceptable
don't-
tactic is slaughtering
don't-
civilians.
Ah.
And we partner with
I don't care about
largely
you.
organizations and countries that want to partner with us in order to combat those forces, because those forces are almost always negative. Like there's no terrorist organization that you could bring to me that
I
I would be like,
know.
oh yeah, the IRA,
John a
when they
chance.
flamethrowered a bunch of British
Yeah, I'm
troops and when
playing
they
the
did a bunch
game.
of car bombs, in
I got too
Belfast. That was
excited
actually
about
great.
the-
Like you're never
I
going to
got
get me
it.
to find
You
say
would,
that.
if this was 1776, you would wear a red coat. I got it. That's what you just said. You've just said if it was 1776, you'd be wearing a red coat now.
I'm not a fan of British monarchy. I'm a bigger fan of republicanism, like the American ideals that set up
Yeah,
our
but they
country.
like
70-76, I'll
they
be
hurt
crying
people, they shot people, they
because
threw
of the
people,
first
they threw
partition.
tea overboard, they did all types of things. It
4
doesn't
years
mean by
earlier.
default, because you don't like someone's tactics, that by default they're a bad guy. It doesn't mean by default we're a good guy. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is we are an empire
Right.
and we are involved in things that we as Americans don't need to be involved in. That's the critical piece. We made a war on terror so that we can invade Iraq, so we
We're
can
just
invade
allies
all
tonight,
other
man.
areas
I'm
instead of
gonna
just
challenge
going
Wait,
after
can
Al-Qaeda.
can I comment on this for just a moment? I wanted to connect the idea of like NATO being an extension of American empire. And what I like about the original founding articles of NATO is that they're unbelievably simple. You can read them within 10 minutes, so it's not like hard to mislead people of exactly what they're about. And it's all built around
Wick is not
Article
moderating.
5. And what this means about Article 5 and the veto power is that if we want to add Ukraine, if we want to add Belarus, if we want to add Georgia, whoever it is, every single nation
Russia.
state has to agree. It's why when I hear like, oh, in 2014, NATO expansion is what caused the war, what confuses me is the Hungarians, the French, the Germans, the Turks.
US.
Like, half of NATO was not okay with the idea of Ukraine joining because they were terrified of the idea of something like that provoking a wider conflict with one of their major trade partners. And so when someone says it's an extension of American empire, if you give any one state, including Hungary, veto power, it cannot just be an extension of an American empire. It is also an extension of local sovereignty because they have an impact on how these decisions are made. And it's not just when it comes to veto power, it comes to the council. But one way these states could assert more power, and one of my main critiques of NATO, is more European defense spending, making up a larger portion of NATO defense spending. So America can burden share in a way that Americans more appreciate and is more fair to what's at stake to us and what we gain out of the relationship,
And that
which
is starting
economic
to
trade,
happen a bit.
European stability, and a lack of a major World War II style event in Europe.
Poland is.
I
And
like
John
that.
and Gary, I know you're
I'm
ready to
not
go.
fighting on that.
I know you're ready to go. I just want to give you a little bit more to chomp on. Just a little bit more to chomp on. You
Concise,
mentioned
too. You know, we
energy.
gotta give it to
I
him.
will be very concise. You mentioned that NATO leaders mentioned that they are effectively a global energy security apparatus. I would argue that's important. So do you not agree that that is important?
Okay.
Well, security for who? Energy security for
Oh,
who?
wow.
It's certainly not the
Everybody's
energy security
pro
for the
NATO.
countries that NATO bombs and attacks. I mean, when NATO attacked Libya, for example, and I'll kill two birds with one stone here, it destabilized the entire oil infrastructure of Libya, threw it into the hands of a extremely unstable situation. NATO themselves, NATO arms ended in the hands of terrorists, of groups like ISIS. So when you're talking even about the war on terror, I actually don't disagree with you that the war on terror is a bad thing, or this notion that we need to fight terror, that we need to control terrorism, that we need to control things like radical Islamic extremism. But what actually happens, and Dylan points to this intent of NATO, but the problem is that no one has ever seen an intent. We don't see a defensive intent. We don't see a democratic
It's
intent.
in the founding
Let's look at the
documents.
The real actions that we see from NATO have been to destabilize countries, often using terrorist groups, radical groups as proxies, to destabilize countries and sovereign governments that are in the
NATO-
process of creating
NATO
a
took
sense
control of
regional
CIA
autonomy,
now.
regional sovereignty.
It's always
Charting their
CIA,
own
but
path
now
so
it's
that they
NATO.
can promote their own culture, their own identity, their own sovereignty, their own traditions and way of life. But NATO wants to destroy that, and it uses human rights as a pretext in order to basically say, oh, this country is not acting in a way that's in compliance with the liberal set of values that we have in the United States. Well, this is basically just another colonial holdover. I mean, it echoes of the Heart of Darkness, the book by Joseph Conrad, where we believed that we had all the virtue in the West and that we were willing to use any amount of force and barbarity to impose our world vision on the rest of the world. And that's exactly what NATO's doing again. So again, through the funding of terrorists to carry out its missions, we've seen that not only in Libya, but we also saw that with these ethnic supremacists in Yugoslavia. We're seeing that, of course, in Ukraine with the neo-Nazis there and the Ukrainian nationalists who are direct descendants from Stephen Bandera, by the way, ideologically. So this is NATO's
What?
role. He's there in Yugoslavia. We're seeing that, of course, in Ukraine with the neo-Nazis there and the Ukrainian nationalists who are direct descendants from Stephen Bandera, by the way, ideologically. So this is NATO's role. And when it comes to energy security, again, this is energy security for a transnational elite.
I would like to push you on Yugoslavia.
You didn't make Connor mad at all with any of that. Connor was like okay with all of that. He was like, yeah, that's true. Yeah, he loved it all.
Well, no, hold on. So I actually. Well, yeah.
Well,
like,
can I just quickly say, when we talk about NATO, there's a few things.
That's great.
Oh, sorry, you can
Just real
go,
quick,
Connor.
real
It's
quick,
fine.
real quick.
I'll go
yeah,
last.
real quick. Connor, concisely,
Yeah,
but
so-
then we'll give it to Dylan. Yes.
That's good.
Well, I don't know if I can because I'm about to kick another can of worms. So when it comes to Larry asked me a pointed question in a joking way, and I'll say it. Yeah, absolutely. Like the spectrum of diplomacy and warfare. Like Clausewitz has this quote that actually really opened my eyes on conflict, which is war is diplomacy by other means, right? So when you're looking at what is politics? Politics is power and who is in power. Like, what are these political ideologies? They're how our societies are structured.
For some countries,
and I think
it's not
that there are
diplomacy.
real moral differences between, let's say, the system of liberalism or, let's say, authoritarian theocracy or authoritarian communism. I think there's real moral differences here. So if my
Authoritarian
ideology
communism.
is actually evaluatively better than the ideologies that it's in conflict with, saying that my ideology came into conflict with an ideology that you think should have, like, I don't know, peaceful existence on another part of the planet, I don't really care. It doesn't really land for me, right? One of the things that I wanted to push, which is the can of worms that I want to kick, is the ethno-supremacists in the Yugoslavia. So my understanding of Yugoslav history is the fact that what happened was Tito was running, we need Larry back. Tito was running Yugoslavia, and it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, polity where the Serbs had disproportionate political and military control. After Tito died, there was a power vacuum. The Serbs wanted to maintain the former maintain Yugoslavia. They started kicking the ass of the Croats and the Bosniaks and the Serbs and the Muslims and all that kind of stuff. And then the Croats kicked back, and then they started slaughtering the weaker section, which was the Muslim Bosniaks. That's my understanding of the conflict.
Right.
So I want to touch what you just said real fast. The last piece, not the Yugoslavian piece, not that piece.
Hey,
Not that
Hold on. We're gonna skip
Dylan,
one at a
speak.
time. Larry, you can address
A
his
Serb is a Serb.
piece
Yeah.
you wish to address. Then
Just a
I'm
small
gonna let
piece about
Jen-
the von Clausewitz piece.
Then I'm going
on
to let
war.
John respond to his response, and we're going to let Dylan in here. That's the order we're going to go into. So we're going to go Larry, we're going to go John.
I'm listening and I'm taking notes.
Yes. Look, on the von Clausewitz piece, which is what I'm going to talk about. You're right. I agree with you. Right? War is, diplomacy and other means, whatever. I agree with you. But I think America
Not
does
always.
best when it is the shining light that people want to follow versus the people bombing. I would say that our culture, when it is at its best, is far stronger than any Marine who lands on a beach, than any bomb we could drop, than anything we could do. I would rather us
what a
be the
hippie.
example that people follow. And one of the
Fits
examples I'll
to
give
the
you is
hippie
early
dippy.
on, after World War II, a lot of countries began to follow. Even after our first 1776, 1789, countries did begin to follow us. They did try to, and we weren't fighting everybody. I don't think we have to go to war. I don't think we have to
As
join
opposed to now, who is the U.S. fighting now?
NATO. I don't think we have to be bombing people, and people can still follow our example.
Okay.
John, please.
Yeah, I want to go into the Yugoslavia points just to really kind of understand this conflict. Because, of course, what you pointed out, counterpoints, it's true. There was a vacuum. There were ethnic tensions in Yugoslavia and the Balkans for some time. But it was really the NATO bombing that exacerbated atrocities to a level that they hadn't been seen before. Of course, this was done under the pretext of a humanitarian mission. A lot of this narrative was actually imposed after the fact. But here's the reality on the ground. When NATO started bombing Serbia,
John,
the U.S. had complete knowledge
John talking about realities on the ground is a very comical concept to me.
that this bombing would escalate atrocities. In fact, NATO General Wesley Clark even said this explicitly. He worried that the bombing of Serbia would escalate ethnic atrocities, which of course it did. Now, the U.S. was trying to exert the dominant pressure that it had through the Dayton agreements in Yugoslavia for some time. But in many ways, I want to point out how the war in Yugoslavia was also an infringement on the sovereignty not only of Yugoslavia and the people in the Balkans through this use of this massive military force and bombing campaign, which basically created a situation that NATO would have preeminence in the region. But it was also an attack on sovereignty of major European countries like Germany. The Europeans, Germany, France, had forces on the ground in Yugoslavia at the time. But when the United States decided to launch its bombing campaign, the United States knew full well that the response from the Serbs to that bombing campaign would be to attack the NATO troops that were stationed in Kosovo and Serbia and so on. And so part of the bombing campaign here actually put the strength and power over Yugoslavia into the hands of the United States, explicitly wresting it away from who would have control of Yugoslavia from the other major European powers. So once again, this wasn't even just an example of the United States exerting hegemonic power over a government that it found unsavory, but it was another example of the U.S. exerting hegemonic power over the entire continent.
Okay,
Hold on. Dylan wants to go real quick, and then I promise
Real
we'll
quick.
get a chance to respond. I do have a question for
John
everyone
is a
involved,
genius.
to kind of
John
maybe
is
guide
a
things little bit, but
genius.
Go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, you know, when we started bombing the Yugoslav army, the war lasted like 73 more days and then it ended. So there was a genocide going on for 10 years. Then we bombed for 73 days and the war's over. People talk about the violence that happened during those 73 days, civilian casualties. But there's also a mercy in ending a war, ending a genocide of 10 years in and of itself. This is not really a debate about specific Yugoslavia, though. I don't know if we're really going to get into, like, let's talk about Srebrenica, let's talk about all these genocides. I think it's going to become too much of a diversion, but we can do that. As for NATO weapons and ISIS,
Right.
I assume what he's talking about is a report that has to do with American weapons that we were shipping
Well
to Syrian
done.
rebels through Timber Sycamore, ending up in the hands of certain Syrian rebel groups that then traded hands again and again and again.
You're gonna take this, John? You're gonna take this without responding? Get him, John. Get that lib. With his awful gay values.
So they ended up
Get him.
in the hands of ISIS, but that is
Get
different
him.
than NATO weapons in ISIS, because NATO weapons in ISIS would suggest that it was a NATO operation sending NATO weapons from NATO states to ISIS, when it was an American operation sending weapons to Syrian rebels that then kept trading hands until it got into the hands of ISIS. Which I do think is a little different because one is under the preview of America and the other is under the organization of NATO.
NATO,
For example,
yeah.
aid to Ukraine is coordinated by NATO. Aid to those Syrian rebels was not coordinated by NATO. So I would not call those NATO weapons. I would call those American weapons, and they were given to Syrian rebels, not ISIS, then traded hands because it was a very brutal and terrible civil war. As for NATO wants to smash local cultures and sovereignties, and that's their purpose. NATO was founded in 1949 with a ton of colonial powers in it. Great Britain, Portugal was still a dictatorship under Salazar, I believe. There was also the Dutch. They wanted to include Indonesia in NATO to make it protected by its boundaries. Salazar wanted to include Angola, I believe. I forget everybody that wanted to include everything. But it was clear from both, I believe it was certain American Congress people and others were clear that they would not accept NATO where these colonial possessions would be controlled because no American wanted to go to war over Angola. No American wanted to go to war over Indonesia. Americans had just bled over Paris. Americans had just bled over Germany. They felt a lot more attached to that. They felt a lot more invested in that project. They did not feel invested in the project of
Well,
colonialism.
America did
And
not
so when
want
Article
to
5
stay
was
in
originally
Europe all that
instituted,
much
these
either,
colonial
to be quite
possessions were
honest.
not included. The only colonial possession that was included was French Algeria until the 1960s when the Algerians kicked
To
the
be quite honest, the US was a bit forced to stay, to be invested in the project of Europe
French ass.
by the USSR.
And then NATO was like, you know what? We're not going to be part of this colonial project. That's a bad vibe, chief. So if it was part of that project, if the purpose of NATO from the beginning wasn't the main purpose, which its articles clearly define, collective defense, and it was destroying local sovereignty, then they would have worked with Salazar to control the Angola. They would have worked with the Dutch to control Indonesia, and they would not have excluded it from Article 5 protections. That was done on individual countries' basis, but not within the framework of NATO. Also, good examples, Larry, don't protect civilizations. You still need guns, you still need alliances, you still need collective defense to deter invasion.
No, you do. Of course you do. But first off, America's not going to be invaded. That's not a thing right now. I mean, maybe in 100 years, that's not a thing.
But America has
But I'll
allies.
go back to this. And the point is, yes, you do need guns to protect people. Of course you do. But look at Vietnam.
So you already had massive amount of refugees before the Serbian bombing. I mean, Dylan Burns already mentioned that there has been a genocide going on for 10 years because the, you know, the bombing. 75 days of the war, 10 years of genocide averted. Basically, a trade-off.
You brought up colonialism. The United States went to war basically in Vietnam. First, this is the French. To try to
The
hold
United
their
States. It wasn't a
colonies.
NATO mission. The rest of the NATO countries
Yes, but
disagreed with it
well, let me keep
terribly, so
going.
NATO didn't
True. That's true.
participate.
Yes, but let me keep going. I said America. I didn't say NATO.
Okay.
NATO went into
That's fine.
Vietnam, fought for about 10 years, give or take, dropped more bombs than we dropped on Japan and Germany combined, killed millions upon millions of Vietnamese, maimed millions, and then at one point just walked away. 1975, we basically just said, all right, we're out, we left. Now, you might go, wait,
Also, Vietnamese people were born with deformities due to Agent Orange, but that's neither here nor there. What does that have to do with NATO,
wait a
though?
minute, Larry, we had to fight them, to fight the commies, or maybe Connor might go to fight the bad guys, or whatever he might say, right? We got to fight the bad guys. 10 years later, we're trading partners. You can now buy furniture from Vietnam. That's my entire...
Yeah, but Vietnamese war was a much more complicated affair than just fighting commies. It was about France winning its colony back. It was about Ho Chi Minh going to the US for help against the French and being turned away, and then going to China. It's far more complicated than is what's being presented here.
point. You could just leave people alone, and they will often wind up
find this
deciding,
terribly
okay,
naive.
we'll be good. We will eventually do
Larry?
the right thing
You cannot just leave people alone. Come on.
for eventually. And if they won't, hold on.
Okay.
And if they won't,
shit.
us bombing them doesn't make things better. They're still gonna be bad or whatever we decide is bad. There's gonna be. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan, 20 years to replace the Taliban with a better armed Taliban. We did nothing in our wars. We did nothing in our fighting, and that's my point. I'm not
The
saying I'm
Nazis
not
should
naive
have
to
been
think
just
they're
left
all gonna
alone
be
and they'd
awesome.
be good.
But you're naive to think bombing them is going to fix them.
I'm not.
That is
wait.
my point.
I
That's
never
not
said
gonna
it.
fix-
I never said to bomb the Vietnamese.
Well, Connor,
I mean, I'm gonna be honest. Your friend is not wrong for hating France more. I'm gonna remind everybody that France is the main culprit for the Vietnamese War to begin with. So maybe the analysis is not as narrow as you believe.
said that. You
Okay.
kind of said that.
I-
Connor definitely said that. Yes.
I'll let
said
Connor
that.
respond.
Like, France is being let off the hook far too often with the whole war. Just because the US ended up being like the main thing at some point, it doesn't change the fact that the culprit is France at the end of the day. And it wanting its precious colony back. Oh, the panelist. Okay, I get it, yeah. Yeah.
Respond to that if it was directed towards Connor. But I just do want to say that we can't just trade our problems away with everyone. This neoliberal consensus that built in the
Yes.
1990s, that if you just trade with the Chinese, they're all going to love democracy and they're all going to be singing the Hong Kong songs in a few years. It's nonsense. That's ridiculous. It's more than that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's what you believe, but what
wanna-
I am saying is that I do agree with the Vietnamese. And you can tell from Ho Chi Minh's conversations with American officials and his love of the Constitution, his love of certain American values, and him attempting to contact American officials to try to advocate for the Vietnamese independence movement.
Yep.
I say that there could have definitely, in my opinion, been a different approach. Definitely when you know the Vietnamese
100%.
hate the Chinese, and it's not like they were going to be long allies forever. Yeah, I think that there was ways for us to work with them differently. But when we talk about, for example, and again, this is a separation between me and Connor. And that's why I love.
But we have to take into consideration also that the US had certain loyalties to France itself. It wasn't just, in a vacuum that the US decided, oh, screw you, Vietnam. Like, the US had certain ties to France. Hello, Lefty Mac Lefterson.
This debate. We have people from every single end of the political spectrum in here. In my view, my goal of NATO, which has always been the primary goal of NATO, is to stop incursion into the transatlantic area. Is to stop those incursions because America is the number one global reserve currency. Then you've got the euro, which is the second global reserve currency. If that area was to go into war, economic chaos, if those interconnected tradeways, which, I mean, one of the main export markets for us is the Europeans. One of the main imports market for us is the Europeans.
Not one of the main. The main. I think the US right now invests 4 times more into Europe than in Asia and other places. It's not one of the main markets. It's the main export market. And
it will be extremely have a huge negative effect on Americans. And so for me, I think we should concentrate on the main goal of NATO. I want to keep NATO as simple as possible. I think that there's some like anti-piracy stuff that you might be able to do, but my goal is a simplified 1949 style NATO to stop war in Europe. That should be the primary, main, and most of what NATO does.
I just like bugging Connor because of both Marines.
Although at the beginning, NATO's army was quite small.
He's like an aggressive Marine. I'm a passive Marine. I just think it's funny.
Yeah, and John, I'll let you go, but I'll say, like, I'll bite down on if you're like, hey, you're like a liberal, hegemonic, international bully. I'm going to be like, yes, that's me. Please continue. So, yeah, sorry. Go ahead, John.
No, you're good. It seems like we do have a bit of a political compass in here, although I think that I should be on the top left here. Larry's definitely in the right position there at the bottom right. But here's what I'll say is when it comes to Dylan's argument pushing back that NATO is not a tool of colonial or imperialist authority. I mean, the argument's just a bit silly because it goes along the logic that, well, NATO hasn't expanded into these former colonial holdings, therefore the infrastructure of NATO hasn't been imposed on Africa or South America, so therefore it's not a colonial institution. But the reality of NATO, the very nature of NATO, is to be a tool for the imperialist powers to maintain domination, and would have absolutely no good to impose Article 5 on these parts of the world.
That is such vague nonsense. Get to some sort of like a specific argument, John.
Don't have that vested interest in maintaining a security umbrella under that of the United States. And I'll point to an example because I want to go back to the example of Libya, which is actually what I was referring to when I was talking about the proliferation of ISIS, the flow of weapons in Libya that ended up in the hands of ISIS and other radical Islamic extremist groups. I mean, this is well documented, and still to this day. We know that the bombing of Libya resulted in a huge flow of arms all across North and West Africa. But when it came to the bombing of Libya itself, I mean, there was an effort by the African Union at this point to engage in negotiations, to actually have the powers come to the table and find a diplomatic solution. What ended up happening is that a few days before NATO initiated its bombing campaign, which was spearheaded by the French and also the United States, they basically said, diplomats, you have to evacuate. We're going to launch this bombing campaign against Libya. And I think this is a perfect example of how the West prevented the African Union from bringing all parties to the table and actually engaging in a form of sovereignty and in diplomacy that could have put Northern Africa on a much more stable track. And once again, the ill effects of this aren't only impacting the nations like Libya, which went from one of the most prosperous nations in Africa to literally a nation with open-air slave markets and ISIS resurgence and all of this, but it also has a destabilizing effect on the other host country that is has a parasitic relationship, or the United States uses a parasitic relationship on, which is Europe, which is having to deal with the flow of migrants that are coming now from North Africa and former colonial holdings, because precisely we do not want to allow the infrastructure, the means of production, to go into the hands of the people and governments of these regions and of these nations to use as they see fit. And I think this is the core of what we're seeing with NATO.
So I want to respond quickly.
We'll give it to Dylan. We're going to give it to Dylan, and then we're going to give it counter. I know everyone wants to have a say.
So,
Dylan, counter, and then I
don't want to rehash the intervention in Libya too much, but that was in 2011. NATO was created in 1949 with 14 articles. The main purpose of NATO, as I said before, as the articles clearly state, is the defense of the transatlantic area. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO had an identity crisis. It had no clue what it was going to do. But countries still clung to it because of the chaos in Yugoslavia, in the risk of instability, the risk of just not being part of the defensive structure. They wanted to be part of something that could give them stability. And you could shake your head, Larry, but the Poles disagree with you. The Bulgarians disagree with you. Half of Eastern Europe, actually the majority of Eastern Europe disagree with you. Now, they might be wrong when it comes to your interests, but when it comes to their interests, I think
Yeah,
it
that's true. Like Poland, when it wanted to join the European Union, like I remember we covered a news section recently on stream, and everybody said, "Hey, since we're joining the European Union, it's a given that we're also joining NATO, right? Like it's a package
makes sense
deal."
that they would want the most powerful kid on the block in their neighborhood protecting them. In 2004, when the Bulgarians joined, they clearly said, we're joining because right now the Russians are down and out, but they're not going to be down and out
Not
forever.
'cause for cash. They joined for cash, man.
Wait,
They
when you
wanted
say
the
for
dollar.
they joined for
their own economic development.
self-defense,
Yes.
collective defense.
That's not true. Poland, like if Bulgaria did it remotely for the same reason as Poland, then it was definitely because of Russia presence in the continent.
you
What's
can-
wrong
you can
in a
advocate-
global
if you can-
hegemonic liberal
don't call it
capitalist
cash
order?
if
What
it's
is
like
wrong with
self-preservation.
economic development?
It's not about, they weren't afraid that Russians were going to invade. They wanted American dollars. This is about American money. This is all
Wait,
about
you
the
don't
industrial complex.
Okay, I'm
This
sorry.
this was
I'm
not-
sorry,
they didn't
Sharp.
think the Russians were
I'm
gonna
sorry,
invade.
Sharp. This
No,
to
hold on,
me,
hold on.
this to me is the libertarian house count example, okay? Libertarians, once again, being completely dependent on systems they don't understand while feeling fiercely independent. The reason why
Go
these
ahead.
countries
Make the
join NATO,
insult.
you can say, that wasn't an insult to you, it was an insult to the libertarian movement. I love you, Larry. You're my favorite libertarian, and I mean that. I love you
Thank
as an
you.
individual.
Thank you.
We just disagree fervently. My problem here is with Bulgaria, they openly stated that they were joining NATO because they understood
Sean is my favorite individual.
that the Russians would not be down and out
Russia's
forever.
not gonna stay down
And they were right. And they're not the only ones who had this sentiment. And so when we say like, oh, they did it for cash, they did it for money, or they did it for the military industrial complex, if that's the case, where is the military industrial complex in these countries that they could kick in the high gear and beat back the Russians? Because in these countries,
No.
well, let me finish. In these countries, they do have military manufacturing, but the interests at play from the lobby power the military industrial complex has in Bulgaria, Romania, versus the basic need of self-preservation of the state, which is the goal of every country at all times, it's its own survival, which is basic IR, then yeah, the Bulgarians, I think, are going to pursue that. And I think it's a much more likely reason than we're doing this because of the almighty military industrial complex, which is everywhere all at once controlling everything.
Okay,
Like the movie.
I need an opportunity to, it might be a little bit of friendly fire, but I'll try not to be too mean about it.
Yeah, of
Listen,
course.
These issues for me are not.
All countries in the region disagree. Like literally, Poland was like, "Hey, we want to join the European Union, but it's a package deal with joining NATO, right? We're gonna join NATO as well, right? We're gonna be safe from Russia together." Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Like I've seen this little show about NATO today, and there was a lady from Hungary that was like, "Oh, I was born during like the Cold War era, and then suddenly we were in the European Union and in NATO, and we were all extremely happy because of this huge positive change."
Discreet. So what happens is John and Larry are accusing the American military-industrial complex, the global hegemonic mixed economy capitalist system, into wanting to get into these countries in order to get access to their raw materials. They're also accusing the locals of wanting to get into the almighty American hegemonic system because their elites will profit from it or whatever. But my point is that I believe in mixed economy capitalism. I think it's a powerful vehicle for success. I don't think that the poorest people in these foreign countries are worse off under the American liberal hegemonic order than they are under, let's say, an authoritarian communist order. And therefore, this isn't a bad thing. Getting into these countries, volunteering, like Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, all these countries, volunteering to become a part of like the European.
Nobody mentions Poland. Poland should be mentioned. Right, of course. Of course.
Union if they were ever granted access to it, or if they just have preferential trade relationships, or if they have preferential defense agreements. These aren't bad things, and just because they're material doesn't mean that they're profane.
Well, in the case of Hungary didn't join in European Union, sort of help with that as well, with the border disputes.
Our lives are dominated by materials. Almost every single one of you, we're complaining about like oil stability and how we're always sticking our noses in everybody's affairs. But almost everyone on this video camera, if you look into the background, it's covered in plastic. Like 80% of the products that are on screen right now are plastic, and people are watching this on a plastic device. So I'm not going to go back to Yugoslavia just because I feel like we moved past it. But one of the main things that I want to address that I think has not been addressed so far that I want to make absolutely clear. I do not agree with Larry that we can leave people alone and then they are going to develop and they're just going to admire our model and then they're going to come over to our.
Yeah, that's just stupid. That is a very silly sentiment. Russia was left alone for so long. Like the entirety of the West was like, oh yeah, we're just gonna do business with Russia and it's gonna be fine. And we are where we are now, thanks to that whole we're gonna leave them alone philosophy of life. Russia was left alone. And now we have a war in Europe.
Model. I think the perfect example of this is China. Mao Zedong, up until the 1970s, was very scared that his communist project was going to fall apart as soon as he died, to the point that he did the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s. Almost immediately after he died, there were capitalist sympathizers who completely revolutionized the Chinese economy within a matter of decades. Now, that has had incredible economic impacts, but they kept the authoritarianism. They kept the Han ethnic supremacy. They kept the
John is
thought
smiling.
police. They kept a security apparatus that basically monitors you on different degrees. And then also we have a whole bunch of
Also, the Hungary is a very interesting sort of topic with the minorities, etc. Because Hungary used to be quite big, actually, and some terrains like the Transcarpathia topic is a very interesting topic. It used to be Hungary for quite a long time, actually, like 1,000 years or something insane.
alleged human rights abuses that actually are quite comparable to the National Socialists, but because economics are so intertwined, we cannot publicly criticize people who, in frankly, my mind, are morally monstrous.
So let me cover a couple of those, if I could. There's many of them I want to cover. The first one I'm going to talk about is NATO and the dollars piece. All I'm saying is what I heard from you. If I'm wrong, then you tell me. What I heard from you is they were afraid the Russians were going to invade them and destroy them, and that was the number one issue.
That was one of the not just the Russians, but yes, that was a much more motivating factor than access to the military-industrial complex for profit.
But the military-industrial complex does several things for them. Number one, it allows us to pay for the defense. It allows them to not have to get nuclear weapons. It allows them to go off and do the things that I've been talking about, which is be capitalistic.
Oh, that is such a horrible thing to claim, that individual countries should want to and aim to get nuclear weapons. We don't want more countries with nuclear weapons. That is a very bad idea. A very dangerous idea.
Make money, all those types of things. It allows them to do these things.
You keep saying cool things, though.
Yes, I'm not against that. That's a good thing. I'm happy about that, but you and I agree with this completely. I have a moral issue on this part, though, with you, Connor, which is you said if we leave them alone, they'll come to us and model our ways. That's not what I was saying at all.
To be clear, he said the opposite of that. He said we can't just leave them alone and then they will.
No, he said that. That's what I said.
Oh,
he said that. I said that, right? Right. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying they're going to all of a sudden act like us or be. They shouldn't. Who the hell are we to make them? That's the point. They should go their own way.
No,
right. Let me finish.
Their own way is what's existing right now that I have sincere moral objections
Yes.
to.
Hold on. I know you're saying when the Chinese became democratic, they kept authoritarianism. Okay, great. When we became democratic, we kept slavery for 100 years.
Okay.
When we after that, we then kept we kept Jim Crow for 100 years. We've done bad things too.
And if
hold
there was
on,
an international order that invaded us in order to end slavery, then I would be like, listen, it was a little messed up, killed a whole bunch of civilians, but they were kind of right about the slavery.
But we
thing.
did it on our own, is my point. We did it on our own. We killed about 700,000 of our own people.
Oh, come on, that's not how the world works. Yeah, we should have just left the Nazis. They should have, they would have just sorted themselves out, I guess. So come on.
Suffered while they were waiting for us to figure it out.
So who decides, and this is the other problem, when it may be slavery, that seems obvious to me, but some people would disagree back then. Our founding fathers would disagreed with that, but whatever the case may be, your idea is that we should decide what's right, and we should use a gun or bomb or whatever, and you're nodding your head, to make that happen. And that is where my libertarianism kicks in hardcore. And this is not me thinking about a system I don't understand. This is a moral issue. It is not the right issue for us to come in and decide that some other nation should be like us and use a gun to do so. Now, the last piece I'll bring up.
John's
Hold
really
on.
chomping at the bit. I see his face.
Okay.
I want to give you one quote from Full Metal Jacket. Okay.
Great movie, by the way. Great movie.
Inside every
Go for
single Vietnamese person, he uses a different word, is an
Yep.
American waiting to come out. And
remember
so
that.
From my perspective, Americanism is not like an ethnic thing. It's a concept. It's a system of ideas. It's a system of beliefs. And I do think that they're fundamentally correct.
Could you be any more jingoistic? I don't think you could be any more jingoistic.
Yeah, I could have used the G slur.
Hold on. Let's give it to John real quick, and then we'll.
Good point. Point
Let's-
taken. Point taken.
Let's be clear.
Yeah.
What Counterpoint is saying is not entirely wrong. I think that a lot of people have looked
Okay.
for centuries to America as
John.
an example of how to reclaim your sovereignty, of how to kick out an empire, whether it's through the use of force or whether it's establishing your own sovereignty through setting up institutions that are extremely effective
Like
in
Ukraine.
reconciling the contradictions of that
I
present
think it's
moment.
just Nazis.
But it's funny you point that out, Counterpoints. That's a funny quote that you use, because it was actually Ho Chi Minh who quoted George Washington during the Vietnamese armed struggle as a justification and a comparison for how the Vietnamese were actually fighting a similar struggle against the Americans. So to the extent that there's an American inside everyone in the world, maybe there is, but that's only insofar as those people are demonstrating their own right to self-determination, their own right to sovereignty,
Like
and to
Ukraine?
claim that, to claim their own resources, their own tax dollars to use to the development of their own civilization. Now, I think that is correct.
Civilization.
But here's my point. That when it comes to this global system that we have, you're kind of acting as if things are existing within a vacuum. And you use China as an example of authoritarianism. On one hand, pointing to the fact that China introduced all of these great economic reforms that led to all this development, which is absolutely true, while still being under the very wise stewardship, I would say, of the Chinese Communist Party, which is exactly the reason why they were able to use those gains to actually go back to benefit the society, to actually result in a social development for the Chinese people. Because we've seen plenty of countries, plenty of examples. I mean, India being the most comparable of another country in the region, a huge country that has not escaped from under the boot of U.S. hegemony and has seen a very different path in its development over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. What's the key difference here? It's sovereignty. And to the extent that China has instituted a number of things that you characterize as authoritarian or dictatorial, this has largely come in the context of the entire capitalist world converging on China to try to reverse the gains of the revolution. And of course, more recently, this new Cold War that we're in, that aims to blunt China's influence in its own region, in its own backyard. So, of course, there's going to be a level of political...
Oh, yeah, of course, in its own backyard, in its own territory, because as we know, Vietnam and other countries in the region are just pawns. Like, people like John think of countries as pawns if they're not some big players, some big poles.
Political crackdown. But I don't think that you could really give one good example, you or Dylan, of how the United States, of how other countries impose a form of dictatorial or authoritarian qualities that the United States itself doesn't replicate. So here we find that we are mired in an empire of hypocrisy. Basically, every time you point the finger at that country for being a dictator or authoritarian, I can point to you a number of examples of the United States doing the same thing. Here, I invite you.
Do it.
Okay.
Okay,
Do it.
I definitely
Please,
have.
take up the challenge, but then I do have a question that's been on my mind that I really do want to ask to both sides.
Okay,
One for each. But go ahead.
Jesus, okay.
We're doing
I'm
good
gonna
tonight, guys. We're doing
picture
good.
Gauntlet.
Are we?
Gauntlet. I'm going to pick up your gauntlet, and if I need to ask you again, just remind me. But I want to hit a point that you brought up, before. So one of the things that you said, or at least one of the things that I inferred from what you said, is the fact that there's a difference between the sovereignty of individuals, overseas or countries or whatever, making their own determination. And one of the things that's really interesting is you guys brought up American interventionism that has failed. I think the most obvious ones being like Iraq, Afghanistan, right, in the war on terror. What I would cite to you, which, you know, NATO, the reason why this is prescient, or the reason why this is important, is probably because of Ukraine, right? And the reason why
yes.
I would say
Perfect.
that Afghanistan fell within 11 days, the reason why Iraq lost half of its territory within
Finally,
2 weeks
my
of guys in
ballpark
white trucks
topic.
is exactly because of what you said. It's because people conceded territory that they didn't care about, sovereignty or authority that they didn't want to fight and die for, and as a result, they had to redouble their efforts later in plenty of blood and treasure in order to restabilize their countries after the fact. And so that's well taken. But what I would cite to you is Ukraine is actually an example where you do have a population on
John
the
believes that Ukraine is just a bunch of Nazis. He said already in this
ground
debate.
who is willing to fight, because what was supposed to be a very easy steamrolling of the current Ukrainian government has turned into a 3-year protracted conflict in which Ukrainians are still going into the trenches in order to fight. So that's what I would cite to you, is there are people who are willing to fight for this. I'll respond to the gauntleted question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
that's
yeah,
what
okay,
I'm
so I'll-
encouraging you to get
I'll-
to, because he made his
Sure.
very specific ask. Can you point to anything?
The specific question: what
Yeah.
is the authoritarianism that was not
America
replicated
does
by
not
within the United
replicate.
States?
Right.
So China currently stands accused of having a 2 to 3 week turnaround on vital organ transplants that is likely taken from the prisoner industrial complex. Then on top of that, China does stand accused of having Uyghur Chinese folks of that ethnic and religion,
John believes that the whole genocide in China is a hoax because it's just devised to make China weak and to conquer it with capital. Just saying.
they're largely Muslim majority ethnic enclaves. They are accused of culturally re-educating them in work camps, as well as taking Han Chinese men and forcibly introducing them to Uyghur women. I don't think that you can find that kind of moral evil in American history for 150 years.
Well, the United States stands accused of forced sterilizations at the border. The United States also has by far the largest prisoner population of anywhere on the earth. If you look at it in proportion to
As
China's
forced
population-
sterilization as a policy, or
well,
or are you
I mean,
talking
can-
about like
can-
individual instances? Because that would be a difference. Yes.
I'm talking about a policy.
There's a
of forced
policy if you
sterilization.
cross the border and they take your ovaries.
Well, I'm saying, I mean, these are
don't think that's
allegations,
possible.
right? You're trying to
Well,
assert
there's just
that
not
China
enough
has an
control for that to even have been possible.
overarching policy of
Well, no, I
organ
know that there's been
transplants.
instances of sterilization, but it's
giving
not
you
a policy of sterilization across the southern border for anyone who comes in. That's not a
Please,
thing.
please point to me. Please point to me to the policy of organ transplants. I invite you to look it up.
I didn't say
and
that. It's
find-
Connor, but I just asked you about your policy. That's a pivot to Connor. I'm asking you a question.
Oh,
Well, I was giving
John.
I was giving an example of how the United States.
Yeah, and I'm asking you, what's
engages-
that policy? Is there like a law somewhere, or are they
Exactly.
like? Because I can point to you the
Well,
laws in
what-
China
Hold on,
banning.
okay.
Wait, no, just quickly. I can point to the laws in China like saying like, hey, if you name your kid Muhammad, the type of social benefits you get are going to be different. I can't point to a law in the United States. If you cross the southern
Where's-
border, we're
where's
going to
that
take your ovaries. That's a little different.
Please.
Okay, now you gotta let him respond.
I would love to read that law about naming your child
Get him.
Muhammad in China. Please find where they
Get him.
dissuade
Okay.
people from doing that.
I'd love to. One
Love to see
second.
that. If that's true, that's
get him.
please send that to me. But the point is, that the
By
United
the way,
States
I'm not
engages-
defending
John, poor John. Poor John is outmatched.
It is.
China at
In
all.
2017,
I'm not
the
defending
Chinese
China.
here it
Hold
is,
on,
right
hold
here.
on.
2017, the
I'm
Chinese
not
it took me
defending
5 seconds. The Chinese Communist ban enacted bans of lists of Muslim names it deemed too extreme or might have, and I quote, connotations of holy war of spiritualism, aka
Oh.
separatism. Examples include Islam, Quran, Mecca, Jihad, Imam, Saddam, Muhammad, Hajj, Medina, among others.
Oops.
And then hold on
Is this
real
the-
quick. It also took me only a few seconds of internet research in order to find China publicly saying that they're no longer using the organs of executed prisoners, which I'm assuming if we're saying that it never happened, then why are
John embarrassed himself. What a tragedy.
they saying that they stopped?
Oh,
And I want to be clear.
Well-
I'm not defending China. Just to be clear, that's not me.
I know, Larry,
Larry,
this is his
you got
fight.
it.
This is his
But
crusade.
hold on, I want to ask John Jackman.
It's his fight with the
directly because-
sparrows.
Sure. John Jackman, you said that there was a similar policy given at the U.S. border, right? Can you, again, name that policy? I want to give you a very clear chance to answer that.
Well, I'm saying there's plenty of policies that have been enacted that don't give people sovereign control over their own individual bodies and over their own public health decisions in the United States. I mean, this is well documented. Well, such as the COVID
running
epidemic.
away.
This is a pivot.
You're forced by
Already running away from the border thing because it's just indefensible. Gosh.
Well, I'm just saying it's a pivot, but
But I just want to know about, because if this is
Well, I'm just saying that there are various things that exist in the United States, and they do many things. And you know, when you
I want to change this law. That sounds horrible.
The medical decisions, the individual medical decisions,
I want to save
aren't
Mexican
able to be
ovaries.
by
let
an
him
individual
answer.
private
Good. True.
And so I'm saying that there's comparable examples in the United States as well as in Europe of this same level of authoritarianism being employed and being imposed on individual sovereign citizens
Give
to
the
make their
example.
own free health decisions, for example.
Yeah,
and
John.
when it comes to the level of a level of just raw destruction that is brought against people who speak out against the United States empire, the clampdown on freedom of speech. We're seeing that across the table right now, where people who are talking favorably of Russia are being investigated.
There you go. I'm just gonna. This is John. John has nothing of substance. John has a lot of weird anti wokeness vagaries, but apart from that, John has
that
no
are being
leg to stand
prosecuted.
on.
That people who go on the airwaves and speak favorably of issues that the United States finds
That's
unsafe.
not true, by the way. People are not getting prosecuted over being favorable of Russia. That's bullshit. There are too many pro-Russian channels or whatever for me to believe that. Like, John here is pro-Russia openly and talks about it. John is not being prosecuted or investigated.
Can become political targets themselves. China targets extremism. The United States targets extremism in its own way. But of course, the United States is doing so from a position that is much more unstable and insecure, because the United States is losing its foothold as the global dominant hegemonic power. And so we're now seeing
I have a rebuttal.
I understand.
I never got an
So I
answer to my
understand what he's
question.
saying.
they're being imposed on behalf of large capital interests.
But
saying
just so I
I didn't
understand
hear
what
anything
you're
about
saying,
Guatemalan ovaries in that
I
statement. It
understand.
was a lot of.
But just hold on.
A lot of
Just so
nothing.
I understand what is being said. John Jackman, is your assertion that America is less stable than countries such as Russia or China? Is that what you were asserting today?
Well, I think
I would-
one can make a very strong case the United States is in fact less stable than countries like China and Russia. You can just look to
John,
you can look.
John,
You can look
I don't
to
want to. I don't want to interrupt you. I don't want to interrupt you, and I don't want to smirk too much, and I don't want to be too much of a smartass. However,
I want to.
let's use one as an example. People being suppressed for their God-given right to conscience and free speech in the Western world. I think probably the most extreme examples that you could think of that were public were Snowden, Assange, and the Tenet media revelations recently, right? So Julian Assange was accused of like a sexual assault beforehand. It was likely used as a pretext in order to keep him suppressed into the Ecuadorian embassy. But he also stood accused of basically stealing government secrets, unredacted, and publishing them worldwide, which ended in the deaths of intelligence figures, worldwide. When it came to Edward Snowden, he did try to do the whistleblowing, and some people revere him for that. But he, I actually think that's probably the more egregious of the two cases. When it comes to Tenet Media, these people could have worked for Russia as, declared foreign agents or whatever. But what they did instead is they got people to...
I'm not so sure if they could, considering that the executive order from 2014 or something is still in effect about Ukraine.
Funnel money through shell companies into their organization, thereby bypassing declaratory laws about FARA working on behalf of a foreign government, which by the way is a rival. So I see this as, you could say is this really free speech? Are we feeling like governmental pressures to go a certain way when it comes to the narratives that we chose? I could agree with that, relatively speaking. But what I would say is during the Hong Kong protests in China, there were half a dozen to a dozen protesters who were killed by cops, and one of the most egregious stories was a teenage girl who was found handcuffed and thrown into the river. So for me, if you take
people being banned from events for talking about Hong Kong,
to declare that you're working for a foreign agency or law enforcement will handcuff you behind your back and throw you into a river, I have a clear moral preference between the two.
Okay.
Well,
I
it
do
sounds
want to.
like- it sounds like
I'll
you're-
let you respond briefly, but then we got to get back to NATO, right? We were
True.
getting
Yeah.
a little off here.
A little bit.
So respond very concisely, very briefly, and then I have a question to get us back on track, and it is to your side first, and then I have a question for Dylan and his side as well. So respond,
Well,
and
it
then I'll
sounds
ask.
like there's not. It sounds like there's not a historical appreciation for the level of authoritarianism in law enforcement in the United States, where people have, of course, been the right to trial.
John is just gonna throw a bunch of vague statements and not gonna back any of them. Like the border thing. The border thing was hilarious.
we still have Guantanamo
Hear
Bay,
you.
where we have prisoners that have not been given the right to a trial.
How many people are in
There
Guantanamo
have been-
Bay?
There's a number of high-profile examples. I
How
mean,
many
you can
people?
go back to Fred Hampton.
And
You
wasn't there
could
an
go
effort
back
to
to
shut it
prominent
down?
leaders.
Like I don't remember like Xi Jinping saying, "Oh, I don't like these Uyghur camps. These are bad." That's not even like a debatable issue.
Where there was established law enforcement connection to literal assassination attempts. If you speak out against the U.S. government, and if you do so in a way that's effective enough, they will kill you. That is the reality. So you
Oh
are
yes, just like John, who is right now literally speaking against the U.S., already a target for assassination.
going to these
Already,
terror stories in China.
poor
Well, I
John.
can raise you a number of my own here in the United States. And if you're talking about
There
fair,
were
I mean,
30
there's a
men in
number
Guantanamo
of
Bay. 30.
Okay.
well,
Uh,
great.
now-
Prisoners of Guantanamo Bay the last couple of decades. It's been more like thousands still. And so, this
So
is
they've
the
shut
reality.
down like the Uyghur camps.
Oh, so it's irrelevant because that's the past and now is now.
Stopped the mass surveillance. They were like, "Oh, this sucks. Actually, we love burgers and freedom and all the whatever." They did
Can
that.
we do NATO? I'm
Yeah,
getting bored.
let's get back to NATO. That's true.
Let's do NATO.
Okay. Once. Yeah. I got a
Thanks.
question for Larry and
Thank you.
for John as well. Given, right, that both of you have said that you think that national sovereignty is important and that NATO encroaches on and in some cases violates the national sovereignty of others. My question for you, is there ever a situation or a set of circumstances where you think that a country's national sovereignty should be encroached upon? And what would those circumstances be? And if NATO isn't the answer when we need to encroach on another sovereignty, what would be the answer to that? We'll start with Larry, and then I want to hear.
Sure. A couple things. It's a difference in a way between saying, and I hope this will be a good example. I didn't know this question was going to come, so I hope I'll do a good example for this. Do I think there should be a draft, or do I think people should voluntarily join the military? Now, I do think America needs a military and a strong military. I'm a veteran, all right? I believe in that. But I do not believe in a draft. Why? I think that if America is a great country, and it is, that we will often, and if something, this
Well,
is
unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes draft is just an unavoidable thing. See Ukraine.
some attack upon us, people, young men particularly, will volunteer to fight wars. And that's been true for centuries. And I think that will still be true. How do I bring that up? I don't think we require NATO. I don't think we require something like that. I think instead we have a UN, which is fine.
Oh my God. The UN, like NATO was especially made specifically in order to not be part of the UN. Like, learn your history. Second of all, it's not just about the draft. It's also about the countries having the necessary equipment and necessary potential to defend itself against bigger neighbors. Some countries just aren't capable of doing that. And that is when things like NATO become really, really useful. Poland would not be able to just defend itself against Russia, even though it upped its spending of, I don't know, military stuff, blah, 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 to 4% GDP.
And we keep that. If there is a situation where countries
Hello,
believe there is a
imagination.
problem or something, then countries should get together and do something about it if need be, right? The idea of throwing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait is a good example of something like that. Now, look, I don't like us fighting in Ukraine. I do not. However, it's countries getting together
The
to...
US is not fighting in Ukraine. Stop saying that. Stop saying I don't like us fighting in Ukraine. No American soldier who's not part of some foreign legion is fighting in Ukraine. The US is only supplying Ukraine with arms. There's no America fighting in Ukraine.
fight in Ukraine. I don't personally like that, but that doesn't matter. You don't have to have
not
NATO
happening.
to push Russia out of Ukraine. You could have a bunch of countries getting together and pushing them out of Ukraine. You don't have to have NATO
What
for
would
that.
the
So
substantive
my point
difference
is,
there be? Just out of curiosity.
the difference is
between
once
NATO
sure, I'm
being an
giving you,
alliance of countries versus
Yep.
an alliance of countries that doesn't call themselves NATO.
because once you have a
So
stand,
that's, I don't know what this person means. That's just a bunch of nonsense. If Ukraine was not provided with weapons, it would not be able to fight against Russia. Of course, Ukraine would not be able to just on its own magically defend itself against the country that supposedly has the second biggest army in the world.
alliance, you by default create an us versus them mentality. That's how it's been always. This is how it always is.
This is
NATO
such
now has to have an
childlike
enemy, right?
mentality.
Even Connors, he's shaking his head. Yes, it's true. The
I
standing
want,
idea
I want
of it,
NATO of the planet. I want to fight space
which
aliens.
case-
This is a waste of time.
But
I
I'd
want to
be
fight
okay.
Russians.
I'm with you.
We
Yes,
need
so
to
that's
fight
why we shouldn't have
tyranny.
NATO. Let's have UN NATO, whatever that is. If we don't want NATO, let's
Yeah.
do UN NATO. Yes, that is the difference.
Greater United
I-
States of America. Yes, absolutely.
I'm not sure I want to go there, my friend. I know where you're going with that. But you asked my you asked that question. That would be my answer. I don't want to stand it in because it
Volunteer.
creates us versus them. If people are doing something wrong, then we volunteer, get together, and we fix it.
John, same
Cool.
question.
Cool.
So I think we need an understanding of
Well, thank you, Jess, the one you know. It's been a while. Thank you for the tier 3 subscription.
talking about sovereignty. And where does sovereignty come from? I mean, this comes from the organic development of communities, societies.
You keep
interacting
using the
with
word
one
organic.
another.
What does that mean?
Yes!
I don't know, and I don't think the audience knows.
Yes! Thank you so much! Thank you so much for asking that question. Oh my god. Thank you. Yes! Oh gosh. Okay.
It means the types of cultures and traditions that arise from the population, that arise from that society historically, and they're organic based on their content.
So just fascistic things, you know? Some countries were just meant to be and they just organically arose, and some are not. Some countries are just artificial. What is this bullshit? What is this fascistic bullshit that I'm hearing? Good question though. What is organic, John? What is it?
Continuity based on their level of attachment to the land, to the historical culture, to kind of a common identity and common form of society. And there's a lot that goes in to that, obviously. But when we're talking about the sovereignty of nations, you know, what do we mean? When we think about nations, there can be nations that are developed on artificial terms.
So what are not?
I'm thinking of nations such as Israel or even Taiwan, whose perseverance has been established only through the domination of a unipolar global power.
That is
If it weren't for
bullshit.
that unipolar global power in the
That
United
is
States,
nonsense.
there wouldn't even be the existence of these entities. So when we're talking about the sovereignty, we should understand it from more of a sociological standpoint, more of a historical and civilizational standpoint, not through the standpoint of just individual nations. Now, I think in general, the principle is that all societies should have sovereignty. They should have the ability to determine which direction their culture and their traditions
Certainly, but
develop.
the question.
So that cannot be done under the umbrella of a unipolar power, which is foreign to most of the communities in which it operates, in which it has its military excursions and its interventions. And I think that NATO at this historical juncture in particular is against the development of that
Are
sovereignty.
you liking this debate, John? John is this is exactly because I've learned a bit about this person, and I've especially decided to watch today's hippie dippy thing because John's in it. The lunatic. John the lunatic from Haas and Jackson Hinkle's communities.
For other regional powers, and
So
it wants
I
to promote this
understand.
uniform kind of set of values that has been produced
But-
and upheld by the liberal world order
Sure.
based in the United
To
States.
be
and Europe.
clear, the question is: under what circumstances should a nation's sovereignty be encroached upon? What would be, in your opinion, a justifiable
I don't
circumstance
see
where
any.
a country or a group of countries can encroach upon the sovereignty of another?
Well, when a
If
nation
any,
doesn't
there
have
might not be any, in your opinion. It's up to you.
Right. Well, I think the example of Ukraine actually is a good example in Russia's special military operation. Because what you had here was an example where there was a democratically elected government. The United States came in and through its underhanded diplomacy, through its own efforts to provoke instability.
A government that starts using violence against its own citizens loses its legitimacy, just saying.
Instituted a government that was hostile to the ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine, who voted.
You got Dylan going now. You got Dylan going now.
Primarily for that former government. And I know I'm going to get Dylan going. So my goal is to get him going a little bit. And so in this case, you had a tradition and history of Russian culture that was based in, for example, Crimea. And you wonder, why were the Russians able to walk into Crimea without firing a shot? Well, it's because Crimea was historically part of Russia. It was part of this organic sovereignty actually of Russia. So this was not illegitimate sovereignty of Ukraine. Crimea was only given to Ukraine as part of an administrative transfer in 1954 under this this notion that the Soviets wanted to go into this kind of multicultural
what an idiot,
experiment.
John!
It was this really gesture of good faith to Ukraine that they were going to build up another multicultural republic, even though Crimea...
Yes, I'm gonna give you the hardest prompt ever. Draw this panel. Draw this panel. You know what? Draw this panel. I'm gonna make it big for you. Okay? I'm gonna make it nice and big for you. Draw this panel. That's your art prompt. There you go, nice and big.
had historically always been.
That's the sound of Putin's
Russian.
balls. I know.
And so of course, when we drove into Ukraine, the
Jesus.
majority of
Beginning of
Ukrainians,
time.
No, I have a smart ass response. I'm ready.
No,
Take me off
again,
the
I
leash.
just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to actually talk here.
I wanna hear
monologuing-
this.
That was so stupid, the bit about Crimea. If you even know remotely basic history, you'll just laugh at this. I'm waiting for a response to the Crimea thing.
Desperately.
No.
I'm in.
I
Right.
think
But
no.
we're gonna
I
give it
I
to
think
the other people. Yeah.
Yeah,
Has
I
your
think
point been
Di-
made, John? Has your point been made? Do you feel like your
My
point's been
point
made?
has been made.
He,
Feel
made,
free to
he
respond.
gave me
It's
more. He gave
stupid.
me
Go
more
ahead.
than enough.
Go
to
ahead.
go with. So okay, so I'm sure Dylan can get into the nitty gritty of history, so I'll definitely let him go second. But I wanted to point out that like when it comes to organic, naturally developing, right? We're human beings. The truth is that a healthy chunk of what we do is socially constructed, and I would see social construction as a form of like an extension of
God.
like organism. So when it comes to liberal republicanism, there's very clearly a conflict within human society between the individual and the collective. And I think that liberalism, which is kind of like a rule set around the individual, and then republicanism, which is like the rule of law and like collective responsibility, I don't think it solves this conflict, but it gives you a tool through which to resolve conflict over time, largely through peaceful means, which is oftentimes through like elected democracy. That's why I like republicanism. And so I think republicanism is
Wow.
infinitely more preferential on a organic, natural, evolutionary, cultural level for people to be able to express their desires, because oftentimes in authoritarian societies, you just have the authoritarian saying, this is the way it is, and then you have individuals suffering under the yoke of that collective authoritarianism. And then here's another thing about naturalism coming
I'm
into our
loving this.
politics. So I believe it was Socrates. It was one of the dialogues or something like it, like Xenophon's dinner or something like that. And there was a really powerful Athenian man who was complaining about how democracy was such a pain in the ass, and all it is really a bunch of weak people voting in their own power, and how the powerful of society should just be let loose to do as they please, because clearly the gods have ordained.
It's fine. I don't really care about counterpoints. I care about John. John is the person that I came here for, and his wild opinions about Crimea. And yes, let's be clear about this. Crimea has absolutely not been always historically Russian. It has been made Russian very artificially, beginning from the 1700s when Catherine the Great has sort of conquered it. She got rid of the Greeks. There were many different groups living in Crimea, among them the Tatars, who were, of course, then purged by Stalin. But it's a long story, and a story of how John is illiterate about history.
them to have like additional wealth and power and influence.
Just listen to Listen, Estelle, just listen to John speak and you'll know. You'll have the answer to your question very quick.
And money and all that kind of crap. And so Socrates, being a smartass, basically responded like, hey, but isn't democracy a natural outflow of the weak banding together in order to restrain the strong? And so when you look at these organizations, you're saying that Taiwan is an organic. You're saying that, Israel is an organic. You're saying that, I don't know if you apply this to Ukraine, but parts of Ukraine are an organic. I would say that these countries reaching out to their regional neighbors and reaching out to international partners in order to assert their sovereignty is a very natural, very organic development. I do have more, but I'll leave it there for the sake
We're
of
going to give it to Dylan. Dylan, hold on.
I want to do one sentence, then I'll shut up. One sentence, and when I'll shut up.
One sentence, Larry. Then we're going to go with Dylan because we got a lot to cover, not a lot of time.
The reason why I don't want the war in Ukraine is not because I support Russia. I think Russia is awesome at all. Russia is obviously the bad guy, horrible. I hate us fighting in Ukraine because I don't want war. I
hate those spineless whims that say, oh, I'm not pro-Russia. I'm not pro-Russia. I just don't want to support country being able to defend itself from Russia. Well, then you're pro-Russia. At least own it. Don't be a spineless wimp.
Heart libertarian. I want the war to end. Just be clarity. I'm not supporting Russia. Therefore,
then you should support Ukraine if you really, really want the war to end. Like, come on. War ending for war ending's sake is just stupid. You have to think about what happens after the war ends. What are the consequences of the war ending for the people involved, especially in Ukraine? You have to think a bit. Just because it's out of sight and out of mind, it just doesn't mean that people will not suffer, actually. You have to at least take into consideration what sort of end to the war you want. Not just end for the sake of end.
Done it. I just want the war to end because I hate war. That's all.
Well, that's a really
I want to clarify just my position real quick before Dylan goes, so that way he can go based on
concise. Dylan has to go though, but be very concise, please.
But I'll be very quick. So my position is not a uncritical support of Russia, and it's not even saying that, for the example of Ukraine,
that's
all
bullshit,
of its sovereignty
John.
is illegitimate. What I'm saying here is that the natural development of relations between Ukraine and Russia, absent a foreign...
You're critical of Russia is absolutely uncritical. If we go on a list on your opinions, John believes that actually Russia did not shut down a passenger plane in 2014. He believes it was Ukrainian separatists. John is just...
Barry!
Thank you for the $5. My sense on the Russia-Ukrainian war is that Ukraine should be left alone and Putin should suck.
Influence of the United States and NATO would be one of cooperation, would be one of building this channel, this Eurasian economic interconnectivity that NATO actually wants to interrupt to preserve its global agenda. So that's my position.
Okay, Dylan, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Brotherly nations, the Ruski Mir has arrived. One thing on the stability stuff. This is way old. I just haven't talked in a bit. That Russia's more stable than the United States. I don't know of Blackwater marching on Washington, D.C. while shooting down fighter jets and helicopters because they had a disagreement over who should get what resources by the DoD, okay? Comparing American stability to Russian stability, when the type of politics and internal affairs, which we don't even get to see everything that's going on in Russia, purposefully, by design, so we don't know a lot about these internal tensions. It's hard for me to hear we're less stable when we haven't had something like that happen here. Okay, I'll just throw that out there quickly. As for how the war started, the Euromaidan movement was promoted by a few factors. The first one has to do with, and this is one that's covered probably the least, is corruption. Corruption's been an issue in Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. It was an issue in Ukraine before the Cold War, and it's still an issue in Ukraine today. They have done certain things, have like public bidding on government contracts, stuff like that, to try to deal with it. That has been helpful, but it was still a major issue that was angering people. So that was a social tension that was there. Then, in the middle of the night, Yanukovych decided, after pressure from Vladimir Putin, where he stopped 50% of trade with Ukraine using economic coercion that the Russians said in the 90s they would not do in the Budapest Memorandum, he pulled out of an association agreement that he ran on instituting when he ran for office in 2012, Yanukovych. Yep. He did this in the middle of the night to try to suppress protests, because if he did it during daytime and people found out about it, well, then more people would be awake. People still came out in protest. The Berkut was sent, special police, beat them very hard.
It's okay, but I had to censor it for a stream, you understand?
People did not react to that well. The protest movement got bigger, and bigger until Yanukovych tried to outlaw protesting, was hiring gang members to brutalize protesters, which were referred to as the Tutushki. This is well documented. Until eventually over 100 people were killed in the Heavenly Hundred, and the Yanukovych government, after trying to ban protesting...
By the way, John doesn't believe that there was violence caused by Yanukovych. John believes there's evidence to the contrary. And I would love John to present this wild, idiotic claim here, and for Dylan to ask for that evidence, and for John to go into the border mode, as I call it, as he did before.
The country...
I love how Dylan can just say basic facts about things and it's treated as it's an argument. I mean, I will say this. It is an argument. It is absolutely an argument. If someone spouts a lot of inane, completely incorrect bullshit, if someone like proudly displays their illiteracy, then you know what? Maybe they don't need an argument. Maybe they just need basic education. I'm sorry. If you have basic facts so wrong on such fundamental level, then you don't need arguments. You need education. And that is what Dylan Burns provides. Like, he's flexible. He's flexible to the situation that he's in.
And a new government was instituted. People try to say it was the United States and American influence and this, that, and this and that. I think it was the lack of dignity that Ukrainians were treated with when they were getting shot. I think it was a lack of dignity that Ukrainians were feeling when their money and public funds were being
Thank you for the $5. Don't swear, Lucy. You shouldn't say bad words. Where did I swear? Maybe I got heated.
Stolen constantly. And nobody can tell me that Yanukovych was not terribly corrupt. He was actively involved in crime in his youth. He was actively involved in crime while...
Well, what I mean by just an argument, I mean as though it's something substantial. What Dylan is saying is an absolute fact, but they're acting as though he isn't a substantial point. But there isn't a substantial point to what he's saying. Oh, I really, well, what I mean by just an argument, I mean as though it is something substantial. What Dylan is saying is an absolute fact, but they're acting as though there isn't a substantial point to what he's saying. I mean, it's providing John education for free.
While in office. The factors that push Yanukovych out are primarily by Americans viewed from an outside, it's us versus the Russians perspective. But when you get into Ukraine and you talk to people, it's a lot more diverse. There's a lot more issues that motivated that protest movement.
Oh, yes.
But the main factor was the fact that the Russians were trying to tell the Ukrainian government what to do with their economics, what to do with their trade policy. That's what motivated Euromaidan. People can say the United States did it through dark money, this and this and this and that. It wasn't United States dark money. It wasn't US CIA agents. It was a bunch of people.
Polish people from the Solidarity movement were among the first to document the Euromaidan, by the way, as journalists. There is a very unique Polish perspective, outsider perspective to the Euromaidan that was not exactly shared by the West at that time because of the experience of the Solidarity movement.
Disrespected.
There was a sense of solidarity of the Solidarity members and the Euromaidan protesters.
Brutalized, who took too much, pushed too far, and then they fought back. As for the idea that if the United States was not here, there would be a productive relationship between Ukraine and Russia. I don't believe that at all.
Same.
The Russian government banned the Ukrainian language during the empire. They were trying to suppress Ukrainian identity.
True.
They went to Ukrainian poets and they killed them. And the same thing happened during the Soviet period as well. They tried to suppress the Ukrainian identity. Many of them had to flee to Austro-Hungary because it was the only place where they could practice their literature, they could practice their language. The idea that all of a sudden bad America...
Very good argument. Wow. Poland isn't real. Well, thank you. Thank you, comrade.
It came on the block, and then Russia was
But that's going to Austria-Hungary was during the Empire period, not during the USSR period. I think Dylan should have clarified that.
like, oh, we got to be mean to Ukraine now. Or, oh, we're doing this because you don't know what's good for you. It's the NATO. It's ridiculous. The Russians have a colonial relationship with the Ukrainians. They're trying to reinforce that colonial relationship with the Ukrainians. And the idea that this is an example of organic, for example, in Crimea. Crimea is the worst example you could use for organic because there was ethnic
Ninja,
cleansing.
people say I'm long-winded. I love you, but
I'm sorry,
still.
I've got to end this. There was ethnic cleansing in Crimea. Crimean Tatars were put into trains and then shifted out by Joseph Stalin,
That's where I thought you were
hunt
going.
thousands of miles away, and then they moved Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, in to get.
By the way, the ethnic cleansing of Crimea did not start with Stalin. It started with Catherine the Great. Just saying, it started long before. It started during the Empire. We have to remember that. Crimea used to be a very diverse place organically.
Better control of the warm water port, which is a strategic asset, strategic resource of the Russians. They didn't just do it to Crimea; they did it to the Koreans. They did it to many people.
I gotta let John respond if he needs, and then I see your hand. Counterpoints. Go ahead, John. Do you have a response to this? Keep it brief. We already.
Yeah, well, Dylan wants to paint things all black or all white. What I'm actually saying is that we actually need to introduce a level of nuance here and understand that there was a push.
John talking about nuance? That's comedy. I'm sorry.
Poll happening in 2014 ahead of Euromaidan. On one hand, you had a significant threat that Russia perceived of Ukraine, its longtime brother nation, being incorporated into Europe, into the fold of the United States in Western Europe.
Bullshit.
And on the other hand, you had the United States that was also recognizing that, wow,
I'm sorry for swearing, but I'm really sorry for swearing, but this whole brotherly nation thing, like, Poland and Ukraine are more sibling nations than Russia and Ukraine. The languages are more similar for one.
a significant population who has supported President Yanukovych, that President Yanukovych is accountable to and having to make decisions for the Ukrainian government, which also played a role in the decision to pull out of the agreement with the European Union. Now, I know that Dylan wants to discount the interests of the people living in eastern Ukraine, but I think that we have to take them into account. The reality
do you mean the people that are being bombed daily now by Russia, tortured, killed? Those people that have to be taken into consideration selectively, very selectively.
Here that the foreign actor who's exerting undue influence on the situation is the United States. I mean, we know this, we can see this even in the calls of U.S. leaders themselves. Victoria Nuland had an infamous call where she literally, before the new government is installed, is handpicking that government themselves.
Have you listened to the call?
No, John does not listen to things. Oh, that is the excited tone in the voice.
Okay, hold on. I think we need a definition of concise. I think that maybe we need a debate on what concise means.
Listen, we're all YouTubers and live streamers. We all love
you're
the
all
app.
guilty here of this.
I
but-
did my sentence. I was good.
I'm sorry, if you're gonna discuss historical topics, you're gonna have to be able to have some room to discuss history. Like, this has to be taken into consideration in these sort of debate panels. If you're going to discuss historical topics, history is not a thing that you can just present in, little bullet points. It's something that you need to contextualize, and that takes a little bit of time. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Like, if someone throws out a completely incorrect statement, such as Crimea has always been historically Russian, you do have to untangle the lie. And to do that, you do have to talk a little bit.
Your sentence. Larry's been the best. He gets gold star for this.
We need to introduce a level of nuance here, and I believe that I'm doing it.
Okay, counterpoints, go ahead.
Yeah, so
You're not doing it. You're just selling your bullshit. You're just selling your nonsense to 832 people.
One of the things that, I know that we're trying to be brief, but one of the things that one of my favorite historical studies ever was Afghanistan before the Taliban, after U.S. withdrawal. And the reason why is because, you're saying undue influence, okay? And I understand that. But one of the things that I opened this conversation with is power abhors a vacuum. And so if you actually look at the Northern Alliance, if you look at the Hazaras, if you look at the Taliban, if you look at all that kind of stuff, each one of them had a sponsor state. Hold on, sorry, I almost said that wrong. Good God, why can't I think of it? But Iran was supporting the Hazaras. The Northern Alliance was being supported by the Uzbeks and Tajiks. The Taliban was being supported by a bunch of Gulf states. and then rivals to the Taliban who were also Islamist were.
I'd love to debate John. Actually, I'd love to debate John on Ukraine. I'm not sure if I'm confident in my debate skill, but I'm pretty confident against John because he says such easily disprovable nonsense.
Being supported by Pakistan. Thank God I finally found it. So anyways, the point is that power abhors a vacuum. If there's an unstable nation that doesn't have like a clear dominant power, then other countries are going to play it to their economic and diplomatic interest. So for me, I know a lot of people, particularly libertarians, they don't like that the world is play or be played, but I don't exactly have like the biggest sympathy for people who apologize for Russia or China, because they're not making defenses of Russia or China because they want the United States to withdraw from the world stage and then everybody's going to start holding hands and there's going to be regional peace. It's because they want to play the same game. They just want to be the dominant force.
Okay, so we are kind
Did I
of.
say
That is
that?
what John wants.
No, you didn't.
Okay, good.
Sure. We're getting kind of low on time, and I don't want to go over, but I do have one more question for Dylan and Counter that I want to get to.
I mean, I wouldn't mind this one going over time. Actually, this is a pretty cool one, but it needs a bit more room to breathe with the history, etc. Topics like this do need a little bit more room to breathe. The time should be a little bit more. Because historical topics just cannot be discussed in brief bullet points.
and answer quickly before we get to wrap it up, closings, etc. So we have the United Nations. They have a provision in their treaty that allows for the removal of suspension of a member's benefits to kick a member nation out if they misbehave. The European Union has a very similar thing. NATO does not.
No. It's just the suspension of rights, yes, but I don't think European Union has outright kicking members out.
What do we do, or what should NATO or an alliance like NATO do when you have, because of the, as Counter mentioned earlier, the interconnectedness, right, with people?
Also, it's in the 14 points that Dylan has mentioned that NATO member states cannot attack each other. I think it said something about not being able to just do a war of aggression, just invade some other country, that NATO members should not do that.
What do you do about nations like Turkey, for example, who, again, some members have decided, oh, I don't know if we like these anymore. So, again, if NATO has no provision for ending a membership, how does NATO handle corruption in its own ranks? When corruption rears its head?
I have the meme answer, so I'll give you the meme answer instead of Dylan's serious answer. I think they absolutely need to add a provision in order to kick out member states that are, additionally corrupt or they engage in warfare that is brinksmanship, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Turkey is exactly the example that I would think about. Them, trying to seize territory in northern Syria, them trying to seize territory in northern Iraq, them, fighting basically fighting our allies, in northern Iraq. I would love to kick them out, and I would love to take the western side of the Bosphorus back for the EU and NATO, and we could have all the chill Muslims live on the western side of the Bosphorus, and then boom, rest of Turkey is for all the a-holes.
Gotcha. Okay, Dylan, what are your thoughts on this?
Kick out the Italians. I don't like them. No, it's for me, it's when we first started NATO, there was this idea that it was a democratic alliance, but there were
we first started NATO. Okay.
Certain strategic locations like Portugal and the islands that they had between the Atlantic that were so beneficial to us strategically that we overlooked it. And it wasn't just in this instance, it's also happened in the 21st century. People forget, but there was a revolution in Egypt against a dictator that was very close with the United States, and it was Obama kind of shrinking away from him that was kind of like the final nail in the coffin of his regime falling. He wasn't part of NATO, but it's an example of like, for strategic interests, the West and most countries, and the communists did the same thing. Every alliance ends up doing the same thing because states end up pursuing power. they're willing to compromise on these values. And so I would say Turkey being a member state now, while having democracy issues around freedom of the press, is nothing new for the organization, but I also think we should hold the organization to a higher standard. For us to have...
I mean, that's the same with Poland. Poland slid down in democracy, and Poland is part of NATO.
For example, like the EU, they have a system where Viktor Orban is one of the most corrupt public officials in all of Europe. Hungary has some of the most highest...
Keep in mind, the process has not been started for Hungary, but it absolutely has been started for Poland, and it only halted after the change of the government recently.
Standard of the highest levels of public sector corruption, constantly taking EU funds and funneling it into corrupt projects to the point where it's a joke, where people will go in and actually take pictures next to these corrupt projects. It's not just them. Other countries are corrupt in Europe too, but the Hungarians have a corruption problem. And so how the EU responded is by freezing funds, trying to add pressure on them. We don't have any mechanism on like that in NATO, and it might be because it's a defense alliance, and the idea of adding those types of things that could whittle down Article 5 or whittle down the deterrence element of the alliance might be risky, but I wouldn't necessarily be against it, but I haven't really thought enough about it.
Fair enough.
No. Hold on. This is you guys are actually making my point that I made up earlier.
Why?
Right? Why bother having a NATO? Join them when you want to join. If the Turks don't want to join us, they can stay home. They don't care.
The problem is NATO is the longest. NATO.
Well, then maybe we shouldn't have them. That's my point. We join up when we want to join up.
NATO is the longest lasting military alliance in history. I believe the last one that went not even close as long, it was like...
What? Was it the Holy Alliance?
It was an alliance against Sparta. I think it was like the Athenian alliance or the Athenian Congress, like 4 BC before Christ. Let me finish.
Larry.
Larry, I understand that. Hey, I'm trying to give you credit. Can I give you well, I didn't finish my response.
Go ahead. I'm
very,
sorry.
Very briefly, then we're going to let Larry respond, and then we're going to...
I'm quiet. I'm getting good.
Over 75 years, we have all standardized NATO ammunition. We have standardized...
Dylan's being steamrolled on his own show.
Our weapons, so everything is interchangeable. We have built a very competent NATO command that now encompasses over 1 billion people. It is the strongest military alliance on the planet, no holds bars. It holds ultimate deterrence potential, but once that 1 billion people becomes 50 million here, 100 million here, 30 million here, it's a lot easier to divide and conquer, especially in places like Moldova, where the Romanians and the fact that they have a relationship with them while being in NATO might dissuade further intervention in Transnistria. Once NATO's not there, what would stop, for example, the Russians taking their illegal troop deployments, pushing forward, and taking the rest of Moldova? They're already interfering in their politics, funneling money, etc. So I do think there's a purpose for it, defensively.
Okay. Larry, respond briefly, then closings. Go ahead.
Yes, my point was that I want us to make these things when we need them, because what happens is what you're talking about.
You need them when you need them. It's like you buy a gun, you put it on the wall, you have it ready for when the burglar comes in.
I was good. Let me finish. What I'm saying here is what's going to happen is what you just said. We're going to start having more control. Early on, I said these things begin to destroy freedom and localism. That's exactly my point. You're talking about it. No, they can't do this unless you do that. You can't do this unless you do that. All of a sudden now they're controlling more and controlling more. No, the answer is no control, no more power over these people. When someone does something wrong, the community of nations gathers together.
Yes, Avengers assemble. That makes perfect sense. Yes. Yes, that would. Oh, yes, that would work so well. What if some people just refuse? What if many members just refuse? Come on. Be a grown-up.
To get like Kuwait. Kuwait's a small country, and we pushed Saddam out of Kuwait. We should have invaded Iraq because of 9/11. That was dumb, right? But pushing him out of Kuwait, sure, and we did it. We got together. I'm not against countries getting together to punish someone who does something wrong. There is no need for NATO. It should go away. You guys just made my point.
Okay. Gang, this has been a robust discussion. There's so much to this topic. We didn't get
Yes, that would be so perfect if a bunch of countries with no coordination, with no organization, with armies that are completely incompatible with one another would bunch up and do stuff very ineffectively and incompetently. That would be the best thing in the world. Why have NATO when you can have chaos? Great.
chance to cover it all. Maybe we have part 2 sometime. But I'd like to thank everyone for being here and give them a chance to have closing statements. And so, yeah, we'll just go in the reverse order that we started, and we'll start with John Jackman, and then we'll end with counterpoints. John Jackman, go ahead. Closing thoughts.
We're not gonna be watching the second debate. I'm not interested. I am only interested in John and nobody else.
See from the pro-NATO argument is basically an argument for social chauvinism that kind of mirrors the colonial and imperialist legacy that we've seen from Europe and the United States for centuries. Because in the end, the one common thread that you'll find for all the targets of NATO is that NATO hates when countries or peoples stand up for themselves and are sovereign. They don't want to see strong and sovereign nations in South America. They don't want to see strong and sovereign nations in Africa or Asia either. And when nations make a effort to reclaim their resources and to build up their own infrastructure based on their own social needs that are determined by the people in a democratic process that is connected to the needs of the people, then NATO will stand up against that if it counters the interests of NATO. Now, NATO, of course, has no problems when it says, you can be our ally, of course, if you have the right financial rules, if you have this kind of liberal economic world order that is favorable to our financial interests, our banks, our corporate monopolies, and so on. Then, of course, there's no problem. But the minute that a country wants to take hold of its own resources and wants to begin to develop like Libya and put social programs in place that are actually utilizing things like the oil for the development of its own country and its own infrastructure, then NATO has a problem with that. And you'll see that theme over and over again. And when NATO actually is either defeated or is forced to reconcile with its own limitations, that's actually when you see countries begin to prosper. Of course, the example of Afghanistan was mentioned multiple times. Now the Taliban have control and the United States has ceded control of Afghanistan, and you're actually beginning to see a level of stability begin to reemerge. Now, I don't want to hold that out as too much of an example, but the same thing could be said of Iraq. I know it wasn't a NATO intervention, but it was a United States one. And Iraq is beginning to flourish once again in the aftermath, coming out of the boot of American imperialism intervention. So NATO as a whole is basically used as a weapon to maintain a source of intimidation in regions that are maintaining their sovereignty. And it has a backstory, it has a history that is riddled not only with the legacy of imperialism, a incorporation of the British imperialism that was basically taken over by the United States, but even some of the most pervasive forms of Nazism were incorporated into early NATO. Its propaganda arms were staffed by Nazis. Even its top brass and leaders were former Nazi commanders. And now today, we live in a world where there are organic, I'll say organic again. I know that Dylan doesn't like when I use that word, but we see these civilizations beginning to emerge.
No, it's just stupid. I'm sorry. It's not like anybody doesn't like using the word. It's just the word is stupid. Like, you're just embarrassing yourself.
Because of their historical continuity, because cultures go beyond even just a century, but that are historical, that are centuries and centuries old, that are through the interplay of different states, nations, societies, and communities, beginning to re-emerge. And that's why I call them organic, because they're time-tested, and they're coming as a result of historical moments and proving themselves, like in China, like in Russia, like in Venezuela, other parts of the Middle East, that are reasserting themselves and are reclaiming their own destinies.
And that's the 2 minutes. So unfortunately, yeah. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your points, and would love to have you on again. Dylan, go ahead.
One question, and I just heard enough words and like combination of words to think this. Have you read a lot of Dugan?
Yes! Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. Oh my god. Oh.
I've read Dugan. I'm not going to deny I've read Dugan, but I wouldn't
Hold on, I have to
say that he's one of my main philosophical influences at all.
Are you at all like associated with like
okay, we can't. Hey, we don't. These are
MAGA communism at all, or like any of that stuff?
We got a hard cutoff at 8:15 here. I'm getting your producers angrily being meetings, right? So
you probably see a little bit behind me.
You guys can discuss the book club later.
Is that MAGA communism? Is that the same thing?
Oh my God, Dylan, is this your closing statement?
I'm starting control. I'm asking,
Cut
I'm
him.
curious.
That's his
Can I
time.
not
Cut
ask
him.
the people I disagree
No.
with what they believe? I'm sorry.
Not during
Okay.
closing. You cannot.
Okay, then let me do my closing. Let me do my
These are your
closing.
rules.
Let me do my closing, okay? Okay, let me do my closing. Okay?
We're trying to get to your closing. It's your closing. Go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
I recommend people go or listen to the Victoria Nuland phone call. I recommend they listen to it in its entirety because something that's really interesting about it is she talks about the need for the protesters to accept a deal with Yanukovych. That they want them to accept the deal with Yanukovych because if they accept the deal with Yanukovych, then they can avoid the crisis of Russian interventionism. The protesters then did not do that, did everything to get Yanukovych out of power, and did not listen to whatever Victoria Nuland was suggesting. So if it was an extension of American empire, it seems like the Ukrainians were not good subjects. As for like me not listening to Eastern Ukrainian interests, my fixer's from Donetsk, most of my friends are from Donetsk, most of them have been displaced, many of them are Baptists that have had their churches destroyed by the Russian army because the Russian does not like Baptists. Well, they don't really like many denominations of Protestants in occupied territory, period, but I care about their interests too. That's why I want them to be able to return to their home. I don't see this war as black and white. I think that there is a lot of like gray in
What do you want me to research? Doing research stream? We can do it right after this debate. Of course. Oh yeah, doing research stream. Sign me up. You listen. If you I don't know, subscribe. Stop being white, and we're gonna go to Dugin right away. There are some interesting debates that Dugin has had that I've
middle, but in Bucha, there's just purely black. Outside of that, I will also say that in occupied territory, there's private property rights are fickle, free speech is not existent, freedom of press is not existent, and the Russian government is spending about $60 million to block.
And also, Ukrainian people are forced to accept a Russian passport and then drafted into the military. That is also a pretty important aspect of Russian occupation.
VPN access in their country. So they want to completely block out any alternative perspective from going into the country. If your worldview and your empire is so strong, why is it that foreign podcasts are so scary and dangerous to your people? If your ideas are so good, why is it that Putin would never go on a show where, for example, like this, where they disagree with people, instead, or listen to disagreements instead of shutting them down, putting them in prison, if you even call it a war instead of a special military operation. As for NATO, and this will be my last thing, we talked a lot about Iraq. We talked a lot about things that are like going into a car and criticizing the cup holders and the desk, but not talking about the engine, not talking about the wheels. The main purpose of NATO was defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. It has succeeded in that. If you join NATO, you're not getting invaded. Its main purpose has been an utter success in that purpose. We didn't get to discuss much of that purpose. Instead, we talked about Libya, Iraq, and a bunch of things that are not the main purpose of NATO and have not been fundamental principles of NATO. If we're going to redefine NATO, then we need to move away from the types of interventions in Libya and towards building Euro-Atlantic stability. That's my ending point. Oh, and also Nazis were hired by both the Soviets and the United States.
Yup, absolutely yes. I've been waiting for this point to be made. Scientists, especially, were poached by the Soviet Union,
including in the military.
Stop cheating.
Sorry.
Man, he's doing a coup of his own panel, right?
is.
Okay, this is a revolution, a color revolution.
I'm sorry, I just come on. These topics do need some brief to explore. They need room to be explored. You just breeze for certain things without having any, it's necessary. These topics need a bit of like build up and stuff.
Larry Sharp.
I'm taking like 20 extra seconds because of him.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
Okay,
no,
go ahead.
I'm kidding. No, the piece I want to bring up here, and again, thanks guys for having me. I love when I come on these shows.
Yes,
I enjoy
okay,
tremendously.
okay.
And Connor, you are my buddy, man. I love you, brother. You're awesome.
All right.
Love you too.
I 100% believe that the world is not perfect and there will be problems all around. My point is, I don't think we need a standing alliance like this. We should get countries together when there's a problem. Standing alliances by default breed corruption and control. We see it every single time. There are many reasons why there are world wars, but many of them right before them, there are lots of alliances. And all of a sudden we have a massive world war. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but they facilitate us versus them. I want us to not do that and focus instead not on NATO versus someone else, but individual countries doing individual things. What winds up happening is several things. Control, but something else. The military-industrial complex becomes part of it. Everyone has to buy my bullets, or has to buy my guns. Let's have some more people join us. We can buy more things. America is in a place right now where about 60% of its manufacturing base is somehow linked to a military-industrial complex. That means government spending, Connor, you know what I'm talking about, is fueling the U.S. GDP. That is not good for us. We are building things to send overseas to bomb people versus building things that people want here in America. 10% of our manufacturing is weapons. That's way too high, right? We should not be doing this. It's not good for us. It also forces us to fight with our dollars. We're de-dollarizing. The BRICS is because of NATO. That BRICS came up because of NATO, right? That's what happened. That's why it happened that way. They were trying to find a way to make that happen. I'm unhappy with all these things. I'm not naive enough to think that people will all of a sudden become us, but I have a moral issue that I think some people disagree with, but I'll say it anyway. I don't think getting people to be better in their own way, in their own time, is our job. And I think if we want to take it on, we should take it on not through bombs and guns, but take it on by being the right example. And to be forward, I do think we should be defending our sea lanes and such. No worries about that. I think trade is not the be-all, end-all, but damn it, it really helps. It makes things better. If I have a choice of bombing a country or trading with them, I would rather trade.
Well,
I think NATO
we all tried trading with Russia, and look where we ended up.
is not required. We can still do it. Let's end NATO and have a better world.
Oh,
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate you. And last but certainly not least, we're going to go to Counterpoints, whose time has been absconded by Dylan, but we're going to give him the time anyway. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'll try to be very effective with my words. So, I would take everything that the opposition said and I would literally flip it on its head and say, cool. Like social chauvinism. All right. Liberalism, republicanism, mixed economy, capitalism, all those things are great. Hate independent and sovereign nations. I don't hate independent and sovereign nations, but I do think that cooperation breeds health and peace and wealth. When they reclaim their resources for themselves, oftentimes what you're talking about is nationalization and specializations that they don't have the ability to do. I'm thinking of Iran and I'm thinking of Venezuela, where they nationalized their oil resources and then they didn't have the ability to develop them for decades because they didn't have the specialization to do so. I'm thinking of the fact that those oil resources are now currently being held hostage against the global market. And since they were overly reliant on their energy as a part of their economy, the ones that got away with their sovereignty tanked themselves. So yeah, favorable to banks and international corporations. Banks are vehicles through which money spreads, and international corporations are businesses that are trying to trade internationally. Comparative advantage between multiple countries trading with each other is not a bad thing. I don't think, it's bad at all. Then buy my bullets, buy my guns. You're right. We design good guns, and so do the Europeans. And we should buy each other's guns, and we should buy each other's bullets.
Is it colored?
Based. We're building guns instead of bullets. Or we're building guns instead of building other things. Building the other things is what our allies do. It's called comparative advantage. Taiwan focuses on microchips. Korea focuses on electronics. Israel focuses on electronics. We now produce oil, so on and so forth. We all have our strengths, and we should all play to our strengths, and we should be better together. Create these alliances when you need them. I do disagree. I think that creating alliances as we need them is what caused World War I and World War II to slowly suck us into the whirlpool of international intrigue. I think a little bit of conflict now is preventing a whole bunch of conflict later. I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And finally, I do rescind me kicking Turkey out of NATO, because while I was joking about that, because, I hate the Turks and I love Polish people more, the truth is that Dylan was correct that using leverage in a alliance in order to get people to behave properly is the best way forward. So with that, thank you, you lovely people. It was very fun.
Beautiful. It's been a great show. Thank you all again. And don't change that channel. There's going to be more hippy dippy content coming up.
Okay, that's it.
That's it.
I don't care about
the show.
Anything else.
Fantastic. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Oh, well.
Is it clipped? Am I staying for commentary or am I dipping out?
Yeah, you can stay for commentary, Connor. Larry Sharp, thank you so much for coming. John Jackman, thank you so much for coming.
Maybe I'll listen to the commentary a bit of what just happened.
And Whip, thank you so much for guest moderating.
Of course.
All right, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Bye.
Yeah.
Larry's my favorite always.
Can I just say before I go though?
Yeah.
Nope.
I
do not say anything.
I am a NATO sympathizer. I'm not gonna be real. I
think Larry's stuck with us. We still got him.
Soldier.
I'll get him out of here. Watch this.
This idea, right? This idea that we can't have standing alliances. I think that the deterrence factor is a huge one. I think, Dylan, your point about how no NATO member country has been invaded is a very strong one. And yes, NATO isn't perfect. They've done some things that are not ideal before, but again, you have to look at the alternatives. Sure, we've made mistakes, but with a world without NATO, how would that look? Would it be better or worse? And I think that, again, we can use our intuition here. We use inference, and we use some evidence from how the world was before, and say that pretty frankly, the world would simply be a worse place without NATO.
Soviets would have dominated Europe for sure.
Yeah, there'd be more corruption, more warfare, more loss of life, more all these things. And look, Yugoslavia, the butcher of the Balkans, NATO, I'm glad NATO went in there. Okay, I'm glad NATO stopped that shit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm not trying to talk smack about John after he left or anything, and I might feel like a post-debate cope session if it's only the debaters who are talking or whatever. But one of the things that I did actually take pretty strong objection to was him being like, "Well, you interfered with the natural orientation of where the Serbs were gonna go in Yugoslavia," and I was like, "The Serbs, yeah, fuck the Serbs." You know,
that's the one thing that confused me, the organic stuff, because like Crimea has always historically been Russia. It's organic.
I know what he's saying.
There was Greek settlers. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the. What do you mean? It's always been? No, it hasn't. I mean, up till Russia didn't exist till 1721. People think that countries exist forever, but it didn't. It existed in 1721.
But, okay, I know what he's saying with parallel regional ethno-linguistic tribes being closer to each other and therefore having more influence with each other. I do understand that, but I do think technology and commerce.
I'm gonna dip because I don't want this to drag out too long. I know you got other stuff to do. Gang, Dylan, Danabo says no coping, and so
no coping.
Yeah, exactly. No coping.
I'll see you guys later. Bye. I love you.
Bye.
It's analysis. It's
Yeah, Connor, I hate to break this to you, man. You're coping. Sure. Okay, you got bodied. You got bodied. Larry did a great job. Look, I think libertarianism is ridiculous, but he had some great points about the anti-interventionism. I think the points about the America projecting their morality on other countries I thought was very salient. And the commie followed up with some of that, but then he got lost in the sauce with some of his examples. Look,
did you see Larry? Did you see Larry and him agreeing, and they're like, yeah, and then John started going a little bit too far, and then Larry's like, oh.
The wise leadership of the CCP, and I saw Larry's eyes go.
Yeah.
He said no.
Look, Larry did a great job. Who was his partner?
John Jackman.
Okay, so John, it was actually kind of refreshing to see some polar opposites coming together on some points. It really proves the point that people of different backgrounds and everything can come together with certain ideas, but their point of views may be askewed, but they still come to the same conclusion, which I think is kind of awesome.
What? No!
Libertarian communism.
Yes, so typically you have the horseshoe theory when it comes to the authoritarian right and the authoritarian left, and they come together on some issues or perspectives on how society should be run. So seeing the north instead of the east-west political compass horseshoe theory, seeing the north-south libertarian to international communist, that was phenomenally interesting.
That really was.
John's not a communist. Let's make that clear. John's ideas have nothing to do with communism. John is a person that centers his whole worldview around social conservatism. That is not communism in any sense of the word, even in the Soviet Union sense of the word.
It's just like Connor, you a pretend conservative and an actual progressive. You're progressive for pay, as I like to say. I love you, Connor. I really do. Parasocial love. But to see you two come together, under the strong progressive ones. No. Look, I'm not talking about progressive for free.
I'm paid by no man.
Yeah, he gives that booty up. FREE. No, I'm talking about you and Dylan coming together and locking arms in solidarity over NATO. Look, y'all had some good points. Y'all really did, but I think.
But
I would
what's
say-
interesting though is every single one of our views on NATO was skewed slightly different. Like for example, Larry was against it for clearly anti like interventionist reasons.
Yeah.
The John Jackman has this, and I'm gonna call it slightly Duganist. It is pretty Duganist.
Yep.
Duganist view of like the organic, the civilizational struggle. Like I can see that for me. So it's totally different. Connor is full like. Victory for he'll start like chanting Latin with an M16 like charging like civilization shall come, and where I am more of the conservative, I'm gonna say conservative as in conservative values, but conservative as in conservative in policy view of NATO that it has preserved this perfectly. We know it's done this perfectly, so continue doing this perfectly.
Yeah, if it ain't broke,
Bill
don't
just
fix the
admitted
type
he's
of
conservative,
mentality.
guys.
Yes, and that's what I was gonna say is that typically, pro-NATOism, pro-American hegemony. There's obviously like a breed of liberal who will support that, but there's plenty of liberals who absolutely hate that, and plenty of leftists who absolutely hate that.
And
So I think
believe it
it's
or
funny
not,
that
there's this people on the right that doesn't want to project American culture where it's not
values or
wanted.
power.
Yeah.
Well, right, and that's what I actually really find interesting as well is the fact that so even Dylan and I disagreed because he was like, no, like we created with these principles and we've held these borders and we followed these principles, and when you're inserting American imperial hegemony under the veil of NATO, then I don't agree with you. Whereas I'm like, yes, based.
Well, no,
Like
my point wasn't that America wasn't
military
engaging in these conversations for selfish reasons. Is that if you go and you talk to the locals, people in this conversation and talking about sovereignty, forget that when you go to these countries, they had to vote to join NATO, and then every other NATO country had to agree to join. That, if anything, that's like one of the most sovereign acts a country could take, joining an alliance to protect their own borders.
Which, by the way, that would be a very good moment to. That should have been mentioned in this whole conversation, that the Soviet Union has created its own alliance to counter NATO, and it was called the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was not voluntary in any sense of the word. Like, there was no, oh, I vote to join the Warsaw Pact, Oh, now I don't want to be in the Warsaw Pact anymore, so I leave it.
Well, and
More
I'm sorry,
sovereign
Dog,
than when
I
Kamala
probably-
Harris took the. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's more sovereign than when Kamala Harris took the nomination. Okay.
See? Well,
Yeah.
Speaking of
no,
Kamala,
but I'm saying talk to Lithuanians, talk to Estonians, talk to Croats, talk to Western Ukrainians. Almost all of them are going to be like, yeah, like we get it. America does fucked up things some of the time, but the truth is we needed their support in order to counterbalance Russia, and this is all based. They don't want to be under Russia's thumb.
Look.
So I hate to
Let's
cut this
sit
off
here.
a little bit, but we have like 4 minutes until the next debate, and so I do think we
Oh,
should
man.
probably
Okay,
talk
okay.
about the debate that's about to happen.
Absolutely.
And I do have to give an announcement.
Absolutely.
Not so erudite at the last moment has pulled out due to health reasons. She
I nominated Dog.
Okay, whatever. I don't care about the next debate. So how was that? How did you enjoy? If you've enjoyed my little commentary, which was just laughing at John basically most of the time, it's cool.